Thaddeus Vane didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode onto the Weller property at first light with 3 armed men behind him, dismounted without being invited, walked straight to the porch, and nailed a single sheet of paper to the front door with a roofing nail he'd brought specifically for that purpose. The sound of that nail driving into the wood was the loudest thing Caleb Weller had ever heard. Vane turned around slowly, looked at the 13-year-old boy standing barefoot in the dirt with his father 4 days dead and his 7 younger siblings watching from the window, and smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows how the story ends. 50 days, Vane said. Then I come back with a sheriff. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. If this story already has your heart, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens when a woman with nothing but stubbornness and $60 decides she won't let a man like Vane win. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The train was 40 minutes late, pulling into Copper Hollow, which gave Miriam Langford 40 extra minutes to sit with her hands folded in her lap and her trunk wedged between the seat and the window and think about every decision she'd made in the last 4 months that had delivered her to this particular moment on this particular morning in the summer of 1884. She was 31 years old. She had $60, a trunk full of practical clothing, a small leather case containing her sewing kit and her mother's Bible, and a bundle of letters tied with a piece of brown kitchen twine that she'd read so many times the folds had worn soft as cloth. The letters were from Jonas Weller, rancher, widower, father of 8 children ranging from infant to teenage. A man she had never met in her life. She hadn't told most people back in Jefferson City what she was doing. Her sister Clara knew. Clara had sat across from her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold between her hands and said, "Very carefully, Miriam. You don't know this man." And Miriam had said, equally carefully, "I know enough." What she knew was that Jonas Weller wrote honestly. He didn't describe his life as easy or his ranch as prosperous. His first letter, which she'd answered through a mutual acquaintance, had said plainly, "I am not a romantic man, and I will not pretend otherwise. I have 8 children who need a mother and a ranch that needs 2 sets of hands. I am offering you a home and my best effort. That's all I can honestly promise." It was the honesty that got her. She'd received 2 marriage proposals in Jefferson City, both from men who promised things they hadn't been able to back up. Jonas Weller promised only what he had. That struck her as the rarest kind of man. So she packed her trunk, sold what she could, said goodbye to Clara, and boarded a train west with the understanding that she would arrive in Copper Hollow, Nebraska, meet Jonas Weller for the first time, and marry him within the week. The train lurched to a stop. Miriam stood, smoothed the front of her traveling dress, and waited for the other passengers, 2 cattle buyers and an older woman visiting her daughter, to step down ahead of her. Then she picked up her leather case, gripped the brass handle of the overhead rail, and stepped off the train onto the platform. The platform was almost empty. That was the first thing she noticed. She'd expected a small crowd. Jonas had written that he would be there, that he'd bring the older children, that they were all looking forward to meeting her. What she found instead was a weathered wooden platform, a station master disappearing into his office, the 2 cattle buyers already walking toward town, and a boy. Just a boy. He was sitting on a horse that was too big for him and watching her with an expression that was doing something very complicated, trying to look older than it was while also trying not to fall apart entirely. He had dark hair and Jonas's eyes, or what Miriam imagined Jonas's eyes looked like from the description in the letters. He had a fresh sunburn across the bridge of his nose, and his jaw was set in a way that looked like it was held together by effort rather than nature. He was, she guessed, 13. She walked toward him across the platform. He didn't dismount. He watched her come. "I'm Miriam Langford," she said, when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. "You must be Caleb." "Yes, ma'am." His voice cracked slightly on the second word, and he didn't acknowledge it. She waited. He looked at some point past her shoulder. His jaw worked. "My father's dead," he said. "He died 4 days ago. We didn't have a way to reach you in time." Miriam heard the words. She understood them individually. For a few seconds, her brain simply refused to arrange them in an order that produced meaning, because the meaning was too large to accept all at once, on a train platform in a town she'd never been to before in her life. Jonas Weller was dead. She had packed her entire life into a trunk and traveled 400 miles to marry a dead man. She stood very still, the summer heat pressed down from above. Somewhere down the platform, a door banged in the wind. "Ma'am," Caleb said. He was still looking past her shoulder, but his voice had dropped to something thinner and more effortful. "The next train east leaves tomorrow morning at 7. I can. You can stay at the boarding house tonight. Nobody'd blame you for going back." "That's what I'm supposed to tell you." "Who told you to say that?" "Mrs. Hargrove. She's our neighbor. She said it wouldn't be right to let you feel obligated. That you came out here under different circumstances, and those circumstances have changed." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. The boy was trying very hard not to look directly at her. His hands on the reins were doing more gripping than necessary. "How are the children?" she asked. That got his eyes back on her face. He seemed surprised by the question, like it wasn't one of the options he'd prepared for. "We're managing. And the baby, Maisie?" Something shifted behind his eyes. Just briefly, just enough. "She's sick," he said. "She's been running a fever. Mrs. Hargrove has been checking on her, but she's got her own family," and he stopped. Started again. "We're managing." Miriam looked at the platform. She looked at the station master's office. The door closed, the posted schedule on the wall, visible through the dirty window. 7 a.m. train east. She looked at her trunk. She looked at Caleb Weller, 13 years old, alone on a horse in a strange town, trying to deliver the worst news in the world to a woman he'd never met, while also maintaining enough dignity not to cry in public. "Can you tie my trunk to your saddle?" she asked. He blinked. "Ma'am, my trunk. Can you manage it, or do we need to hire someone from the station?" Yes, I can manage it." He got down from the horse, finally. He was shorter than she'd expected, and thinner. "You're coming?" "I'm not going anywhere until I've seen that baby," Miriam said. "After that, we can talk about trains." They didn't talk about trains. The ride to the Weller Ranch took almost an hour on a road that degraded steadily from rutted to barely existent. Miriam rode behind Caleb on a horse that wasn't comfortable with two riders and made its feelings known through a persistent sideways movement and occasional dramatic sighing. The heat was relentless. Caleb didn't speak except once, about 20 minutes in, when he said quietly, without turning around, "He talked about you. He was looking forward to it." Miriam didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could, right at that moment. When the ranch came into view, she understood immediately why Jonas had written with more honesty than optimism. The main house was a 2-story structure that had once been well built and was now somewhere in the process of losing that argument with time. The porch sagged on the left side. 2 fence posts along the front approach had fallen and not been replaced. Yard was overgrown. The kitchen garden visible around the south side of the house was barely surviving, and the large barn behind was showing daylight through boards that should have been patched a season ago. The cattle she could see in the near pasture were thin. She'd grown up on a working farm. She knew what neglect looked like, and she knew what grief looked like, and what she was looking at was both at the same time. Caleb tied the horse at the post and turned to help her with the trunk, and that's when the front door opened and the children came out. They came out slowly, uncertainly, the way animals approach something they're not sure about. First, a girl of about 11, with her hair half-braided and flour on her apron that would be Hannah. Jonas had mentioned Hannah in his letters as the one who'd taken over most of the cooking since their mother died 2 years prior. Behind her, 2 boys roughly 9 and 7, pushing each other in the doorway before catching themselves and stopping, straightening up with the sudden formality of children aware they were being watched. Thomas and Eli. Then 3 more, a girl of about 8 and twin boys who looked 6 crowding in behind, and at Hannah's hip, half hidden behind her apron, a tiny girl with enormous eyes and a head of dark curls who could only be Nell, who Jonas had described as 5 years old, and the one most likely to ask whatever question the rest of them are afraid to ask. Miriam counted. 7. She looked at Caleb. "Where's Maisie?" "Inside. Mrs. Hargrove left her in the crib." Miriam walked up the porch steps, past the row of children, through the front door. She followed the thin, reedy sound she could already hear, not quite crying. Something worse than crying. The exhausted sound of an infant who has been sick long enough that even crying takes too much through the front room, and down a short hallway to a small room where a wooden crib sat against the far wall. Maisie Weller was 8 months old, and her face was flushed a dark, alarming red. When Miriam picked her up, the baby's skin was hot enough to feel through her own sleeve. The little chest was working too hard. Her eyes opened and looked at Miriam, without recognition and without fear, just openness. The absolute uncomplicated openness of a baby too sick to have opinions. Miriam carried her back through the house to the kitchen. The children had followed her inside and were arranged in a semicircle of barely contained anxiety near the kitchen table. Caleb stood in the doorway. "I need cold water," Miriam said. "Clean cloths. And whatever medicine you have in this house, I want to see it." Nobody moved for a second. "Now," Miriam said, not unkindly, just clearly. They moved. The next 2 hours were entirely practical. Miriam worked the fever with wet cloths, and what medicines the Wellers had: a partial bottle of willow bark tincture, a tin of camphor salve, and some dried herbs she didn't recognize that she set aside. She sent Eli to the well every 20 minutes for fresh, cold water. She had Hannah start a mild broth from the heel of a bone she found in the cold box, which wasn't cold anymore because nobody had replenished the ice block. She noted that. She noted everything not in a calculating way, but in the way a person does when they're building a picture of a problem they intend to solve. By mid-afternoon, Maisie's fever had dropped enough that the baby stopped the shallow, rapid breathing and fell into something that looked closer to actual sleep. Miriam set her back in the crib and came out to the kitchen. The 7 other children were sitting at the table in the same formation they'd been in when she went in, like they hadn't moved, like they were afraid to. Thomas, the 9-year-old, had his hands flat on the table. Hannah was sitting with very straight posture. Nell had climbed onto the bench beside Caleb and was pressed against his arm. Miriam sat down across from them. "All right," she said. "Tell me what's been happening." There was a pause. Caleb said, "What do you mean?" "Your father died 4 days ago." "Tell me what those 4 days have looked like." Another pause. The children looked at each other. Hannah said quietly, "We've been trying to keep up with the animals. Caleb and Thomas mostly. I've been cooking. We've been trying to keep up." "Have you eaten today?" "Silence this morning," Caleb said. "Hannah made porridge." "There wasn't. We're running low on flour." Miriam looked at the shelves along the kitchen wall. She'd already cataloged them when she was getting the medicine. Half a sack of cornmeal, a small amount of flour, some dried beans, a few root vegetables, 3 eggs. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we're going to do this afternoon. Thomas and Eli, you're going to go check on the cattle and come back and tell me exactly how many there are and which ones look sick. Hannah, you and I are going to figure out what we can actually make for supper. Caleb, I need you to go to your nearest neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, and ask if she can spare any eggs or milk. Tell her you'll return it." "She's already done a lot," Caleb said. "I know. Ask anyway." Miriam looked at him steadily. People like to help when they know specifically what's needed. Don't ask generally. Ask for eggs and milk. Caleb studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "What about us?" This was Nell, the 5-year-old, speaking from beside Caleb with the absolute directness of a child who'd decided formality was a waste of time. She pointed to herself and the twins and the 8-year-old whose name, Miriam was now fairly sure, was Lucy. "You," Miriam said, "are going to help me bring in some water and sweep the front room, because that floor hasn't seen a broom in a while, and when your baby sister starts feeling better, she's going to want to be on it." Nell seemed to find this acceptable. She nodded seriously. They worked. It wasn't elegant. The twins, James and Henry, knocked over the water bucket twice, the second time dramatically enough to require mopping. Lucy turned out to be deeply reluctant to use the broom and needed specific instruction on why simply pushing the dirt toward the wall did not constitute sweeping. Hannah burned the bottom of the cornbread, but not beyond eating. Caleb came back from the Hargroves with eggs, milk, and a look of deep discomfort that suggested Mrs. Hargrove had said things to him that he wasn't going to repeat. They ate together at the kitchen table, all 8 children and Miriam, crowded on benches that didn't quite have enough room, and it wasn't enough food, and it wasn't good enough food, but it was warm and it was shared, and it was the first time in 4 days Miriam suspected that they'd all sat down at the same time for a meal. After supper she cleaned up, and the older children put the younger ones to bed and then came back to the kitchen one by one. Caleb. Hannah, Thomas, who'd reported 11 cattle, 2 looking thin and 1 with a leg problem. They sat at the table, and Miriam sat with them, and they talked about the ranch, the way you talk about a problem you're not sure you can solve honestly, because pretending otherwise had stopped being an option. The mortgage. She'd asked about it, and Caleb had retrieved a folder from Jonas's desk in the front room. She looked at the numbers. She didn't say what she thought about the numbers. She just looked at them and said she needed some time to understand them, and they'd talk more tomorrow. "Are you leaving?" Thomas asked. He asked it the way a 9-year-old asks a question he's already prepared himself to hear the wrong answer to voice flat, not meeting her eyes. "Not tonight," Miriam said. "But tomorrow?" She looked at him. She looked at all three of them, Caleb trying to look like he didn't care, Hannah doing something careful with her expression, Thomas waiting. "That's the honest answer." Caleb nodded like he appreciated it. Hannah said nothing. She got up and started washing the supper bowls. Miriam went upstairs to the small room they'd cleared, for her Jonas's room was closed, and no one suggested she use it, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall. She thought about Clara. Clara would have something very specific to say about this situation. Clara would say that Miriam had done enough, that staying another day only made leaving harder, that she had no legal obligation, no moral obligation, no obligation of any kind, and she should take the morning train and come home. And Clara would be right. Except that there were 8 children in this house, and the youngest one was still feverish in her crib, and the oldest one was 13, and trying to hold the world together with 2 hands that were too small for the job, and the ranch was failing. And the mortgage was in the hands of someone called Vane, whose name was written at the top of the document in a way that felt like a boot on a throat. Miriam lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She didn't sleep for a long time. She was still awake when she heard the small footsteps in the hall. Very light, very deliberate, like someone trying hard not to be heard and not quite succeeding. The footsteps stopped outside her door. There was a long pause. Then a small knock, barely audible. "Come in," Miriam said. The door opened slowly. Nell stood in the doorway in a nightgown that was too big for her, her dark curls loose around her face, holding one end of a worn blanket in her hand. She looked at Miriam for a moment in the dim light. "I woke up," Nell said. "I know. Come here." Nell crossed the room and climbed onto the bed beside her without ceremony, the way small children occupy space completely, without apology. She pulled her blanket up and looked at the same ceiling Miriam had been staring at. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" Nell asked. "I'll be here when you wake up," Miriam said. Nell seemed to consider this. That's not the same as staying. Miriam looked at the ceiling for a moment longer. "No," she said. "It's not. Caleb said you'd probably leave. He said we shouldn't expect anything, because that's not fair to you." "Caleb's smart. He cries at night," Nell said, matter-of-factly. "He thinks we don't hear, but we do. He misses Papa a lot. We all do, but Caleb the most, because Papa was teaching him things." She turned her head to look at Miriam. "Did you love him, Papa?" "I never met him," Miriam said. "But I think if I had, I would have." Nell thought about that. "He was really good," she said simply. "He was really, really good." She didn't say anything else after that. She fell asleep in about 4 minutes with the abrupt totality only children can manage, her breathing going slow and deep and the blanket bunched under her chin. Miriam lay there in the dark with a 5-year-old she'd met 8 hours ago sleeping beside her, and 8 children in this house who had lost the only adult they had left in the world, and a mortgage folder downstairs with a name at the top of it. That made something cold move through her when she read it. She thought about the train at 7 a.m. She thought about what it would mean to be on it. She thought about what it would mean not to be. There wasn't a moment of decision so much as a gradual accumulation of everything she'd seen and heard and felt in the last several hours, arriving at a single point where the options stopped feeling equal. She wasn't going to be on that train. She didn't know how to fix a failing ranch. She didn't know frontier water law or mortgage contracts or how to negotiate with men like Vane. She didn't know how to raise 8 children who weren't hers and didn't know her and had every reason to resent her presence. But she knew how to do the next thing, and the thing after that. She'd spent her whole life doing the next thing. She reached over and adjusted the blanket over Nell's shoulder. And in the quiet of that small room, with the night pressing in around the house, and the cattle in the near pasture, and the creek she didn't yet know about running somewhere in the dark, Miriam Langford made the first irreversible decision of her new life. She stayed. When Nell woke in the morning, Miriam was already downstairs. She'd found enough cornmeal for porridge, and she'd stoked the fire, and she'd checked on Maisie still warm but not burning, which was better, and when the children came down one by one and found her at the stove, none of them said anything. They just sat down. Caleb was last. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. 7 o'clock train, he said. Came and went, Miriam said. She set the pot on the table. Sit down, he sat. We need to talk about that mortgage, she said. And I need to understand everything about this ranch. All of it. The real situation, not the version where you're all trying to seem like you're managing. She looked around the table. I don't need managed. I need to know the truth. Can we do that? There was a moment where the kitchen held its breath. Then Thomas said very quietly, the south fence has been down for 3 weeks. 2 of our cattle got onto Vane's property last month, and he kept them. Said it was fair because of the fence. He kept them? Miriam asked. Thomas nodded. Something hardened quietly in Miriam's chest. All right, she said. Tell me everything. Thomas's information about the stolen cattle sat in Miriam's chest all through breakfast, and through the morning chores, and through the hour she spent trying to make sense of Jonas's paperwork at the roll-top desk in the front room. The desk was chaos. Not the chaos of a disorganized man. Jonas's letters had been careful and deliberate, but the chaos of a man who'd been managing too many things at once and running out of time to manage any of them well. There were feed receipts, mixed with land survey copies, mixed with correspondence from the county land office, mixed with a half-finished letter to someone named R. Weller that Jonas had apparently abandoned mid-sentence. There were 2 different ledger books, one for cattle and one for household expenses. And when Miriam put the numbers from both of them side by side on a clean piece of paper, the picture that emerged was not good. The ranch had been losing ground for 2 years. Since the death of Jonas's wife, Eleanor, the household costs had climbed, hired help brought in for what Eleanor had done, medicine for the children, supplies bought in smaller and more expensive quantities because there wasn't time to plan ahead while the cattle operation had slowly contracted. Not collapsed. Just slowly, steadily shrunk, the way a fire goes out when you stop adding wood, gradually rather than all at once. And sitting on top of all of it like a stone on a chest, the mortgage. Miriam spread the document on the desk and read it twice. She wasn't a lawyer. She hadn't studied contracts. But she'd grown up watching her father manage farm debt, and she understood the basic architecture of how these things work. And something in the language of this particular document snagged her attention the way a loose nail snags fabric small, easy to miss but once caught, impossible to ignore. Clause. Buried in the 3rd page, in the smaller print between 2 paragraphs about repayment schedules. She read it 3 times to make sure she was reading it correctly. Upon the death of the primary signatory, the lender reserves the right to demand full repayment of outstanding principal within 60 days. She sat back in the chair. Full repayment, not continued monthly payments, not renegotiation. Full repayment of everything Jonas still owed within 60 days of his death. She looked at the number at the top of the 1st page. The outstanding principal. It was not a number any failing ranch could produce in 60 days. It was barely a number a successful ranch could produce in 60 days. She was still sitting there, very still, with that piece of paper in her hand, when she heard the sound of horses outside. More than one horse, moving at the kind of deliberate pace that isn't casual. Miriam went to the front window. Thaddeus Vane was riding into her yard. She knew it was him before anyone told her, the way you sometimes know a thing before you have reason to know it. He was a large man on a large horse, wearing good clothes that were slightly too good for a working ranch visit, the kind of clothes that are meant to tell you something about the man before he opens his mouth. He had 3 riders with him, spread out slightly in the way of men who've been told to look imposing without being told explicitly. That's what they're doing. Caleb appeared at her elbow. That's Vane, Caleb said. His voice was flat and careful, I figured. Miriam folded the mortgage document and put it in her apron pocket. Where are the little ones? Kitchen. Keep them there. She moved toward the front door. You're going out there? Caleb's voice had something in it that wasn't quite alarm. Something closer to disbelief. He's on my porch, Miriam said. Or he's about to be. She opened the front door before Vane had finished dismounting, which seemed to mildly surprise him. He was older than she'd expected, mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once, and had since decided that handsome was a young man's game and settled for authoritative instead. He had pale eyes that moved over her quickly and categorized her quickly, and she could see him deciding what category she fell into. She'd spent 31 years watching men decide what category she fell into. She waited on the porch without coming down the steps. Vane completed his dismount, handed his reins to one of the riders without looking at him, and walked to the foot of the steps. He didn't come up. He looked up at her. "Miss Langford," he said. "I don't believe we've met," Miriam said. "We haven't. I'm Thaddeus Vane. I hold the paper on this property." He said it pleasantly, the way you say something that doesn't require pleasantness, because the fact itself does all the necessary work. "I know who you are," Miriam said. "What do you want?" Something moved briefly in Vane's pale eyes, not quite irritation, more like mild recalibration. He'd expected something different from her and was adjusting. "I came to pay my respects," he said. "Jonas Weller was a neighbor. Whatever our business disagreements, I respected the man. Kind. He's been in the ground 4 days." Miriam kept her voice neutral. "Your respects could have waited." "They could have," Vane agreed. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "But business doesn't. I wanted to deliver this personally, rather than through a courier." Seemed the decent thing. He held the envelope out. Miriam came down 2 steps and took it. She didn't open it. "The mortgage on this property carries a specific clause," Vane said. "In the event of the primary signatory's death, full repayment becomes due within 60 days. I imagine you've had time to look at the documents." "I have. Then you understand the situation. I'm not here to be cruel, Miss Langford. I'm a businessman. If the estate can't meet the obligation, I'm willing to discuss alternatives." "What kind of alternatives?" Vane glanced around the yard. At the sagging fence, at the thin cattle visible through the gate, at the barn with its failing boards. His expression was the expression of a man looking at something he's already calculated the value of down to the last dollar. "Fair price for the property," he said. "Enough to settle the debt, with some remaining for the children's welfare. It's more than the bank would offer if this goes to foreclosure, which it will. The children can be settled with relatives." "They don't have relatives," Caleb said. Miriam hadn't heard him come out. He was standing behind her on the porch, his arms crossed, doing his level best to look like a man twice his age. "Caleb," Miriam said quietly. "They should know," Caleb said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Vane. "There's nobody else. Why, he's here. He knows there's nobody else." Vane looked at the boy with an expression of patient tolerance that was its own kind of contempt. "Son," he said, "I understand you're angry. That's natural. But your father made agreements that—" "He's not your son," Miriam said. The words came out flat and certain, without heat, which was perhaps why they landed the way they did. Vane stopped. His patient expression adjusted itself. "Miss Langford," he said, "you came here to marry Jonas Weller. Jonas Weller is dead. You have no legal standing on this property. You have no claim here. I'm telling you this as a courtesy, not as an adversary. Walk away from this situation before it becomes more complicated than it needs to be." Miriam looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the envelope in her hand. She turned it over once. "I'll need to read this," she said. "And I'll need time to consider my options." "You have 60 days, Vane said. "I suggest you use them wisely." He turned and walked back to his horse. One of his riders was watching Caleb with a flat, steady attention that was meant to be felt. Caleb felt it. His jaw went tighter, but he didn't move. Vane mounted, settled himself, and looked back at Miriam one more time. "The offer for the property stands," he said. "It won't stand forever." He rode out. The yard was quiet for a moment, just the sound of the horses diminishing down the road. Then Nell's voice came from the front window. "Who was that man?" "Nobody important," Miriam said, which was a lie, and she suspected Nell knew it was a lie, but sometimes you need a few minutes before you can tell the truth in a way that's useful. She went back inside, sat down at Jonas's desk, opened the envelope, and confirmed that what Vane had said was accurate. The clock, apparently, had started ticking. She put her hands flat on the desk and stared at the mortgage document and the envelope and the piece of paper with her own numbers on it. The numbers did not improve from staring. 60 days. She needed to understand the ranch, all of it, what it actually had, what it actually owed, what it could actually produce. She needed to understand the mortgage and whether that clause, that aggressive, convenient clause, was actually enforceable. And she needed to understand Thaddeus Vane, because in her experience, men like Vane didn't make personal visits to deliver envelopes they could have sent by courier unless they wanted to see something, unless they wanted to take the measure of what was standing between them and what they wanted. She'd given him something to look at. She wasn't sure what he'd concluded. She spent 3 days going over every inch of the ranch's records, every receipt, every letter, every entry in both ledgers. She had Hannah help her organize the papers, because Hannah, it turned out, had a careful and systematic mind that had been going to waste on cornbread and sweeping, and because working together on something concrete helped them both stop circling each other with the uncertainty of strangers. What emerged from 3 days of work was a picture that was difficult but not impossible. Cattle herd, at 11 head, was small, but several were in better condition than they'd first appeared. The south pasture, once the fence was repaired, could support more grazing. Kitchen garden could be expanded. The immediate financial problem wasn't the ranch itself. The ranch was salvageable, it was the mortgage. And the more Miriam looked at that mortgage, the stranger it seemed. On the 4th day after Vane's visit, she rode to town. Copper Hollow had a main street of 8 buildings, which included a general store, a bank, a feed store, a small hotel, a saloon, a livery, a barber's shop, and a law office whose sign said Emmett Crane Attorney at Law in letters that had once been gold and were now mostly suggestions of gold. She tied her horse at the post outside and went in. Emmett Crane was a thin man in his 60s with spectacles and the air of someone who'd decided long ago that optimism was professionally inconvenient. He looked at her across his desk and listened to her describe the mortgage clause without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The clause is aggressive," he said finally. "Unusual, even. Most standard mortgage agreements allow the estate to continue payments following a death, so it could be challenged." Crane made the expression of a lawyer being asked to promise something. It could be examined. Whether it could be successfully challenged depends on a great many things, including how the original contract was negotiated, whether Jonas Weller had independent counsel at the time of signing, and what the court's appetite for. Did Jonas have independent counsel? Crane looked at her over his spectacles. "I represented Jonas Weller in some matters, not in the mortgage negotiation." "Who did?" "He signed it without representation, as far as I know. Vane's lawyer drafted the agreement." Miriam sat with that for a moment. Vane's lawyer wrote a mortgage contract specifically advantaging Vane, and Jonas signed it without having anyone review it. That is, unfortunately, not uncommon. And how many other ranchers in this valley have mortgages with Vane? Crane was quiet again. This was a different kind of quiet, more careful. "Several," he said. "Do their contracts have the same clause?" "Couldn't say. I haven't seen their contracts. Could you find out?" Crane took his spectacles off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked tired, in the way people look tired when they've been aware of a problem for a long time and haven't known what to do about it. "Miss Langford," he said, "what exactly are you trying to do?" "I'm trying to understand what I'm actually dealing with," Miriam said. "And I think what I'm dealing with is bigger than one mortgage." She rode back to the ranch with more questions than she'd arrived with, which was both frustrating and, in a strange way, clarifying. Specific enemy is easier to fight than a general one. That evening, she walked the property line for the first time. She'd asked Caleb to take her, and he'd agreed with the reluctant cooperation of a boy who's not sure walking fence lines with a woman he barely knows constitutes a reasonable use of his afternoon, but who can't identify a good argument against it. They walked the east boundary first, which ran along a dry ridge, and then south, where the broken fence gaped open and the grass showed the marks of cattle that had gone through it. And then they came down toward the lowest part of the property, where the land dipped and the grass changed, got greener, more persistent, the kind of green that doesn't depend on rain the way everything else does. Miriam heard it before she saw it, water, moving. A creek, not huge but steady, pushing along the bottom of a natural hollow in the land, the banks thick with the kind of vegetation that means permanent water rather than seasonal. She stood at the edge and looked at it. "What's this called?" she asked. Caleb shrugged. "We just call it the creek. It runs year-round. Papa used it for the house and the cattle. It goes through the property and then down south through the Hargrove place and a couple others." "Year-round," Miriam said. "Never seen it dry. Papa said it fed off a spring somewhere up in the ridge. Said even in the drought years, when everything else was dust, the creek kept running." Miriam looked at the water moving past her boots. She looked at the property line on the rough survey map she'd brought from the desk, the one Jonas had kept with his papers, and traced the creek's path through the Weller acreage. Then she looked at where it went after it left the Weller property. South, through a long corridor of drought-prone land. Through ranch after ranch that would, in a dry year, depend on whatever water they could access. She thought about Vane's face when he'd looked at the ranch yard. The specific way his eyes had moved. He hadn't been looking at the house. He hadn't been looking at the cattle. She was almost sure. Now he'd been looking south. She didn't say this to Caleb yet. She wasn't sure enough, and she didn't want to speak it out loud until she was. But something had shifted in her understanding of the situation. The question was no longer simply whether she could hold the ranch together for 60 days. The question was why Vane wanted this specific property badly enough to put that clause in the mortgage in the first place. It rained that night, the first real rain in 3 weeks, and the sound of it on the roof was loud enough to wake the younger children, who ended up in various stages of migration, Lucy and Nell appearing in Miriam's doorway, twins finding Caleb's room, Thomas sleeping straight through it, because Thomas apparently had the constitution of a stone. Miriam lay in bed, listening to the rain and the children and the creek sound that she could just make out if she listened for it, running steady and permanent and year-round. She was beginning to understand what Jonas had known. The next morning brought something she hadn't expected. She was in the barn checking on the horse, the one she'd ridden to town, who'd developed a slight favor on the left foreleg when she heard another horse in the yard. She came to the barn door and looked out. A man she didn't recognize was in the yard. He was dismounting from a road-worn horse with the careful movement of someone who'd been riding for a long time and was trying not to show how much it had cost him. He was perhaps 40, lean in the way of men who work outdoors, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had been worn hard for some days. He had a way of looking at the house, and then the barn, and then the yard, that told her this wasn't his first time here. There was a quality of recognition in it, even through whatever he was feeling. Caleb came out of the house. The man saw him, stopped completely. Caleb saw the man. Something happened in his face that Miriam had not seen there before, not grief, not anger, but something more complicated than either. "No," Caleb said, just that word. The man held both hands slightly out from his sides, the universal gesture of someone trying to demonstrate they aren't holding a weapon. "Caleb? No." Caleb's voice was harder now, harder than a 13-year-old's voice had any right to be. "You don't get to come here now. You don't get to do that." Miriam walked out of the barn. Both of them looked at her. The man's eyes went to her with a kind of wary assessment, trying to figure out who she was and what her presence meant. "Who are you?" Miriam asked. A pause. "Rourke Weller," the man said. "Jonas was my brother." The silence that followed had a particular texture to it. Miriam looked at Caleb, whose jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working. Then she looked at Rourke Weller, who was looking at Caleb with an expression she couldn't fully read, grief and guilt, and something that wasn't quite hope but was the thing that lived next to it. "He's been gone 13 years, Caleb said to Miriam. He said it like a verdict. He left. After Grandpa died, there was an argument about the land, and he left and he stopped. He never once wrote. Not once, not when Mama died. Not anything. Rourke didn't contradict this. He accepted it the way you accept something that's true and terrible. "I know," Rourke said quietly. "Then why are you here?" "Because Jonas sent me a letter, about 2 months ago." "I only just got it. I've been moving around," he said. Rourke stopped and started again. He said things were serious. He said if anything happened, I should come. Caleb made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "He's dead." "Things happened. I know that too." Miriam looked at this man, road dusty and clearly exhausted, and clearly aware that he had no standing here and no right to expect welcome, and made a quick, practical assessment. "Have you eaten?" she asked. Rourke looked at her. "Not since yesterday morning," he said. "Come inside," she said. "You're not," Caleb started. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Miriam said, without looking at Caleb. "I'm asking you to let him sit at the table. Those are different things." She looked at Rourke. "You can eat, and you can talk, and then we'll figure out what comes next. But I need to know something first." "What?" Rourke asked. "Jonas's letter. What specifically did it say?" Rourke reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it, and read it standing there in the yard. Jonas's handwriting, which she recognized from the letters she still carried in her trunk, careful and deliberate. The letter was short. It said that Vane was making his move, that the mortgage was the mechanism, but not the reason, that the reason was the water, and Jonas had evidence, but hadn't been able to get it to the right people, that if something happened, the papers in the desk were important. And then, at the bottom, in handwriting that looked more hurried than the rest, "I know I have no right to ask. I'm asking anyway. They'll need someone who knows the land and the law out here. Someone who knows what Vane is willing to do. Miriam refolded the letter. What do you know about frontier water law? She asked. Rourke studied her for a moment. Enough. I've been working land surveys for the last several years. I know water rights law in 4 territories. And Vane? Something shifted in Rourke's face. I know what he's done in other places. Before he came to Copper Hollow, I've been trying to understand how to stop him for longer than you know. Miriam looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Caleb, who was still rigid with the specific fury of someone who's been handed a grief they didn't choose and can't put down. Sleep in the barn, she said to Rourke. For now. You'll work. You don't get to come in here and make claims or demand things from these children. You earn whatever you get. That's the arrangement. I understand, Caleb, Miriam said. He sleeps in the barn. You don't have to talk to him. You don't have to forgive him. But I need to know everything your father knew about Vane and the water, and your uncle may have pieces your father's papers don't. Caleb looked at Rourke, looked at him with 13 years of fatherless fury and fresh grief, and the particular hatred of someone who had decided to hate you because loving you and losing you was more than they could hold. If he does anything wrong, Caleb said, he goes. Agreed, Miriam said. Rourke nodded. He didn't try to say anything else to Caleb. He understood, apparently, that silence was the only currency he had any right to spend right now. That night, after the children were in bed, Miriam sat at Jonas's desk and opened the deepest drawer on the right side. She'd gone through the papers in it twice and found nothing unusual. But something Rourke had said, the papers in the desk are important. Jonas always put the things that mattered most in the back, made her look again. She pulled the drawer fully out, set it on the desk, felt along the back interior of the desk cavity where the drawer had been. Her fingers found something that wasn't wood. She pulled it out. A thin folder tucked flat against the back wall, invisible unless you removed the drawer entirely. She opened it. Survey maps, correspondence, a deed she didn't immediately understand the significance of, and a list of names ranchers in the valley, with dates beside each name and numbers that looked like payment amounts. She sat at the desk for a long time, looking at what Jonas Weller had spent the last months of his life collecting. He'd known what Vane was doing. He'd been building a case. And he'd run out of time before he could use it. Miriam's hands were not steady when she refolded the papers and put them back in the folder. She didn't put the folder back in the desk. She took it upstairs with her. Whatever this was, it wasn't staying in a drawer. Outside, the creek kept running in the dark, steady and year-round, moving south through the valley the way it had always moved, indifferent to mortgages and dead men and the slow machinery of a plan that had been years in the making. Miriam lay in bed with the folder under her mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about Vane's pale eyes moving across the ranch yard, looking south. 60 days. She had 53 left. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the train, she thought that maybe the problem she was facing wasn't just a problem of survival. Maybe it was a problem of evidence. And evidence, unlike money or cattle or fence posts, was something that could be gathered. Rourke Weller did not try to make himself liked. That was the first thing Miriam noticed about him in those early days, and it was the thing that made her trust him slightly more than she'd expected to. A man trying to earn forgiveness from a family that didn't owe it to him had 2 options. He could perform remorse loudly, making his guilt everyone else's problem, or he could just work. Rourke worked. He was up before dawn every morning, and in the barn or the pasture before any of the children came downstairs. And when Miriam came out at first light, she would find things already done that she'd been planning to do herself: a fence post reset, a water trough cleaned, the barn floor mucked out with an efficiency that told her he knew exactly what he was doing with his hands. He didn't try to speak to Caleb beyond the necessary. If Caleb needed to tell him something about the cattle or the pasture rotation, they exchanged words in the flat, minimal way of men working the same ground, with an unspoken agreement not to go beyond what the work required. It wasn't warm, it wasn't close to warm, but it functioned, and that was what Miriam had asked for. What she hadn't expected was that Rourke would be useful in ways that went past fence repair and cattle management. On the 5th day after his arrival, she spread Jonas's folder on the kitchen table after the children had gone to bed and asked Rourke to look at it. He sat down across from her and went through the papers slowly and carefully, the way she'd come to understand. He approached most things without rushing, reading everything twice, not speaking until he had something specific to say. The survey maps took him the longest. He had a small pair of reading spectacles he produced from his shirt pocket. She hadn't known he needed them, and there was something unexpectedly human about the way he put them on without self-consciousness. The way people do when they've long stopped caring about being seen to need something, and he held the maps close and traced lines with his finger. "This surveyor," he said finally, "Aldous Pren. You see the mark here?" He pointed to a stamp in the lower corner of one of the maps. "I've worked with Pren, or worked with men who knew him. He was out of Lincoln, did land surveys for the territorial office in the early 70s. Is that significant? Could be. His surveys were official. Registered. If he marked the spring's origin point as falling within a separately titled parcel, Rourke tapped the deed beneath the map. Then Vane's water claim isn't just aggressive. It's fabricated. He's claiming rights to water that originates on land whose deed predates his claim by a decade." Miriam looked at the deed again, the date at the top. Then she looked at the correspondence letters between Jonas and someone at the county land office, going back nearly 2 years. Jonas asking questions, the land office giving carefully vague answers of the kind that suggests someone has been told to be vague. "The county land office is compromised," she said. "Almost certainly." Rourke took his spectacles off, which is why Jonas couldn't get anywhere through normal channels. "You bring this to the county clerk, it disappears." He knew that. That's why he was trying to find another way. He was trying to reach you. Rourke was quiet for a moment. He set the spectacles on the table beside the maps. He wrote to 3 different addresses over 6 months, he said. "I move around a lot. The last letter found me in Abilene. I got it 3 weeks after he died." He said it without drama. Just the flat fact of it, carried the way people carry the things they can't put down. He was building a case to take outside the county, Miriam said. Someone with authority over the land office, a state-level investigator or a land commissioner. Yes. Do you know how to do that? File a complaint at that level, route it past the county. Rourke looked at her. "I know the process. I've done work for land attorneys before. I know who the right people are in Lincoln, and I know what documentation they'd need to take it seriously." He paused. "The question is whether we can get the documentation there and back before your 60 days runs out." Miriam looked at the calendar she'd pinned to the wall above the desk, a plain thing, a page from a farmer's almanac, with the days marked off in pencil. 48 days left. How long would it take to ride to Lincoln and back? 4 days each way if the weather holds. That's 8 days riding, plus however long it takes to find the right attorney and have him review the materials. "Then you need to leave soon," Miriam said. "Not yet, not until I've finished talking to the neighbors. I need to know how many of them have been paying Vane's water fees. I need names and amounts before you take anything to Lincoln, because 1 rancher's evidence is a complaint. 12 ranchers' evidence is a case." Rourke looked at her across the table in a way she was beginning to recognize a specific, attentive look that she didn't think was admiration exactly, more like genuine surprise that kept recurring. "You've been thinking about this a while," he said. "I've had nothing but time to think," Miriam said. "And a very clear reason to think hard." The neighbor conversations turned out to be more complicated than she'd anticipated, which she should have anticipated. She started with the Hargroves, because Margaret Hargrove had already proven herself willing to help, and because her husband Dale was, according to the children, the kind of man who spoke plainly when he decided to speak at all. She rode over on a Tuesday morning and sat in their kitchen with a cup of coffee going lukewarm in her hands and asked directly whether they'd been paying Vane water fees. The silence that followed was the answer before the answer. Dale Hargrove was a weathered man in his 50s with hands that told the story of 30 years of hard work without embellishment. He looked at his wife. She looked at him. Some kind of marital negotiation happened in that look, the kind that happens without words after enough years together. 2 years, Dale said finally. 50 cents an acre per season for anything that uses the creek water. He told us his deed covered the water rights. He paused. We didn't have money for a lawyer to tell us otherwise. Did anyone else pay? Miriam asked. Everyone south of the Weller property, Margaret said. She said it with a flatness that was its own kind of anger, the anger of someone who's been angry about something for a long time and learned to keep it at a manageable temperature. Fosters, the Lindqvists, Old Man Pruitt before he sold and left, Calloway family, the Deitch brothers. She stopped. At least those. There may be others. Do you have receipts? Miriam asked. Dale looked at her. For what he made you pay, Miriam said. Receipts, letters, anything in writing. Did Vane give you any kind of documentation when he collected? He sent a man with a receipt book, Dale said slowly. I've got the receipts in the house somewhere. I need you to find them, Miriam said. And I need you to be willing to show them to someone who can do something about this. Another look between Dale and Margaret. What are you planning? Dale asked. Miriam told him. Not all of it, not the folder under her mattress, not the specific details of what Jonas had found, but enough. Enough to make clear that the situation with the Weller mortgage was not isolated, that the water fees were part of a larger pattern, and that there was potentially a legal mechanism to challenge all of it if there was enough evidence gathered in one place. Dale Hargrove listened to all of this with the careful evaluating attention of a man who's learned to be skeptical of plans that sound like they might work. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Vane has money for lawyers, he said. We don't. I know. He's got the county clerk in his pocket. Half the ranchers around here are afraid to say his name in public. I know that too. So what makes you think this time is different? Miriam looked at him steadily, because this time someone is asking the question outside Copper Hollow, through someone Vane can't reach. She paused. And because if we don't do something, he takes the Weller Ranch in 48 days, and the children who live on it have nowhere to go. I'm asking you to help me stop that. What you do after that is your business. Dale Hargrove looked at his wife again. I'll find the receipts, he said. It took Miriam 11 days to ride to every ranch within a reasonable distance and have some version of that conversation. Not all of them agreed. The Lindqvists said they were sorry, but they couldn't afford the trouble. One of the Deitch brothers, the younger one, told her flatly that she was a woman from Missouri who didn't understand how things worked out here and she should take her ideas back east before someone got hurt. She thanked him for his time and left without argument, because some doors don't open the first time and sometimes don't open at all, and wasting energy on them is a choice you can't afford when the clock is running. But most of them listened, and more of them than she'd expected said yes. The Foster family, who had 3 children of their own and who had watched Vane absorb 2 neighboring properties in the last 4 years, produced a ledger of every payment they'd made with dates and amounts going back 18 months. Ruth Foster, who was 40-something and quiet in the way of someone with strong opinions who'd learned when to express them, pressed the ledger into Miriam's hands and said, "We've been waiting for someone to do something." We didn't know who to wait for. Miriam carried that home and added it to the folder. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Rourke was doing something she hadn't asked him to do and hadn't expected. He was talking to Caleb, not about the past, not about his absence, or the argument after their father's death, or the 13 years of silence. He was talking to Caleb about cattle, about the specific 2 animals that were showing early signs of a respiratory illness, and what to do about it, about the pasture rotation and which sections needed to rest, about how to read a fence line for stress points before they became breaks. He was talking to him the way a man talks to a younger man he thinks has potential, without condescension and without softening anything. Miriam watched this from a careful distance. She didn't comment on it. She understood that the thing happening between them was fragile enough that any direct attention might crack it. Caleb didn't warm to Rourke, but he stopped refusing to be in the same space as him. He stopped leaving the barn when Rourke entered it. He started asking questions, actual questions, about cattle management and land surveying, and he listened to the answers with the intense focus of a boy who is hungry for exactly this kind of knowledge and had been going without it. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to forgiveness. But it was a beginning of something, and Miriam thought Jonas, wherever he was, might have wanted it. On the 31st day, 17 days remaining, something happened that changed the temperature of everything. Miriam was in the yard when she saw Ruth Foster's oldest boy, a 17-year-old named Amos, riding hard down the road from the north. He was pushing the horse harder than the horse wanted to go, and his face, when he pulled up at the gate, had the specific look of someone carrying bad news they've been riding with for miles. "Mrs. Foster sent me," he said. He was breathing hard. "She said to tell you Pruitt's old place, the one Vane bought last year when old man Pruitt left. There's men there. They've been damming the creek." Miriam went still. "Damming it," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Building a structure on the creek where it crosses the old Pruitt property. Mrs. Foster says if they finish it, they can control the flow downstream. Choose who gets water and who doesn't." Amos wiped his face with his sleeve. She says they've been working on it for 3 days. She didn't know if she should tell you or go to the sheriff. The sheriff won't help, Miriam said. She was already moving toward the barn. Rourke appeared in the barn doorway. Someone's damming the creek on the old Pruitt property, she said. Can they do that legally? Rourke's expression shifted. The easy-working calm left his face, and something sharper took its place. Not if the water rights are what Jonas's deed says they are, he said. If the spring originates on the Weller parcel, and the creek flows from there, a downstream landowner can't obstruct the flow. That's prior appropriation doctrine. It's settled water law. But if they complete the dam before we can prove the rights, then they control the water, and we're arguing about it after the fact, which is a lot harder. He was already walking toward the horses. I need to see it. Not alone, Miriam said. She sent Amos back to his mother with a message: gather everyone who'd agreed to participate, bring whatever documentation they had, come to the Weller Ranch in 2 days. She left Hannah in charge of the younger children, told Caleb where she was going and why, and then she and Rourke rode north to the old Pruitt property. What they found there was more advanced than she'd hoped and less complete than she'd feared. 3 men working with timber and packed earth, a partial structure across the creek's narrowest point, maybe half done. The men noticed Miriam and Rourke approaching and stopped working, watching them come with the careful stillness of men who know they're doing something that might be questioned. Rourke dismounted and walked to the creek bank. He studied the structure. He studied the banks. He walked upstream a short distance and looked at the water flow, the rate of it, the direction. This isn't Pruitt's land, he said quietly to Miriam. She looked at him. What? Look at the survey markers. He pointed to 2 iron stakes in the ground, partially obscured by grass. Those are property boundary markers. This section of the creek, this specific bend where they're building, isn't on the Pruitt parcel. It's on the parcel adjacent. Look at where the stakes fall relative to the creek. Miriam looked. She wasn't a surveyor, and she couldn't read the landscape the way Rourke could, but she trusted his reading of it. Whose parcel? She asked. I'd have to check against the recorded maps. But from what I remember of the survey Jonas had, he stopped. He turned and looked at her. This section of the creek, Rourke said slowly, is on the Weller property. The silence between them held for a moment. He's building a dam on our land, Miriam said. On land he doesn't own yet, Rourke said, and on water rights he doesn't legally hold. He looked back at the 3 men who had resumed their careful watching. He's moved the deadline up. He's not waiting for the 60 days to run out. He's trying to establish physical control of the water before the legal question gets resolved. Miriam looked at the men by the creek. She looked at the partial dam. She thought about Vane's face in her yard, the pale eyes, the pleasant certainty of a man who'd done this before, expected the outcome he'd always gotten. She turned her horse. Come on, she said. Where are we going? Back to the ranch. You're leaving for Lincoln tonight. Rourke looked at her. Tonight, I thought you wanted to wait until after the neighbors came. I'm not waiting anymore, Miriam said. He's not waiting. So neither are we. She spent that evening writing. She wrote a summary of everything she'd found in Jonas's folder, everything the neighbors had told her, every payment, every date, every name. She wrote it clearly and in order, the way you write something for a stranger who needs to understand it quickly. She copied key information from the deed and the survey maps onto a separate sheet. She wrote a cover letter to a land attorney in Lincoln. Rourke had given her a name, a man he'd worked with before, someone he said was genuinely clean, explaining what she needed and why and how much time she had. Rourke sat at the table across from her and prepared his own materials, a technical analysis of the water rights question, written in the specific language of someone who knew surveying law, with references to the prior appropriation doctrine and the specific parcel boundaries and the dam's location relative to the property lines. They worked until nearly midnight. Caleb came downstairs at some point and stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the 2 of them at the table surrounded by papers. I heard what happened at the creek, Caleb said. Word travels, Miriam said, without looking up. Amos Foster told Thomas when he came back through. Caleb was quiet a moment. It's serious, Miriam said. We're handling it. Caleb looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Caleb. Something passed between them, not reconciliation, nothing that clean, but something closer to acknowledgement. Caleb seeing, perhaps for the first time, that Rourke was actually here, actually doing something, that whatever he'd failed to be for 13 years, this was what he was doing right now. You're going to Lincoln? Caleb asked him. Tonight, Rourke said. It's dark. I'll ride slow until there's light. Caleb stood there a moment longer. Then, very quietly, as if he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to say it, the gray horse. Take the gray. She's better on the road than the bay. Rourke looked at the table. His jaw moved slightly. Thank you, he said. Caleb nodded and went back upstairs. Miriam watched the doorway after he'd gone. Don't say anything, Rourke said. I wasn't going to. At 1 a.m, Rourke packed the documents carefully in an oilskin pouch, saddled the gray horse, and rode north. Miriam stood on the porch and watched him go until the darkness took him. She went back inside and sat at the desk. The folder was in her hands. She'd kept the originals sending copies with Rourke, painstakingly made in her own hand, because the originals stayed here where she could guard them. If something happened to Rourke on the road, she still had the evidence. If something happened here, he had copies that would reach Lincoln regardless. She'd thought it through carefully. She'd tried to account for the ways it could go wrong. But the thing about Vane was that she still didn't know how far he would go. She knew what he wanted. She was beginning to understand how long he'd been planning it and how systematically he'd arranged the pieces. What she didn't know was what he'd do when he realized the abandoned bride he'd dismissed in his yard had spent the last month building a case against him. She found out 9 days later. Rourke was still in Lincoln. She'd gotten one message through a writer he'd reached, the attorney. The attorney was interested. Review was underway. That was all she knew. 36 days had passed. 24 remained. The night was cold, a sharp cold that had come in fast from the north, first real cold of the approaching season, and Miriam had put extra blankets on the children's beds and built the kitchen fire up before going upstairs. She was in her room when she heard Maisie stir. The baby was healthy now, genuinely healthy, and tended to announce her nighttime opinions with some volume, and she got up to check on her. She was in the hall when she heard the other sound. Not inside the house, outside, footsteps in the yard. More than one person, moving with the kind of deliberate quiet that isn't casual, the quiet of people who don't want to be heard, which is its own kind of loudness if you're listening for it. Miriam stood in the dark hallway and listened. Then she smelled it. Not smoke yet. Something before smoke, the specific smell of lamp oil that doesn't belong outside on a cold night. She moved fast, down the hall to Caleb's room, hand on his shoulder. Caleb, get up now. He was awake instantly, the way children in hard circumstances often sleep shallow and ready. He looked at her face and didn't ask questions. Wake Hannah and Thomas, Miriam said quietly. Quietly. Everyone stays in the house. Do you understand me? He was already moving. Miriam went downstairs. She knew where Jonas's rifle was. She'd found it in the first week and made sure it was loaded, and she'd practiced with it twice in the south pasture because she'd grown up on a farm and her father had taught her that knowing how to use a tool was better than hoping you'd never need it. She took it from its place beside the desk and went to the front window. 4 men in the yard, 3 by the barn, 1 moving toward the far side of it. 2 of the 3 were carrying something the shape of it, the way they moved with it, told her what it was before she could see it clearly. Torches. Not lit yet. Not yet. The 4th man was positioned closer to the house than she'd expected. She couldn't let them light the torches. If the barn burned, the horses went with it. Feed went with it. Without the horses and the feed, the cattle couldn't be worked and couldn't be kept. Without the cattle, there was no ranch, regardless of what happened in Lincoln with Vane's legal claim. He didn't have to win in court if he could simply make it impossible for the children to survive the winter. She understood in that cold moment exactly how Vane thought. She opened the front door and walked out onto the porch. The man nearest the house saw her and froze. She raised the rifle. Put those down, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Put them down and get off this property. The 3 by the barn turned. They looked at her. They looked at each other. The calculation on their faces was visible. Even in the dark, she was one woman with 1 rifle, and there were 4 of them. The one nearest the house took a step toward her. Ma'am, he said, in a tone that was almost apologetic. You should go back inside. She kept the rifle level. The last person who told me what I should do, she said, is currently losing a legal case in Lincoln. So you'll understand why I'm not taking your advice. The man by the barn, the one carrying the oil, she could see it now. A flask of it took a step sideways, trying to move out of her direct line. She tracked him. I see you, she said. He stopped. There was a long moment that stretched and stretched, full of the cold night air and the sound of the creek somewhere in the dark, and her own heartbeat, which was loud but steady. Then, from behind her and to the left, from the darkness beyond the barn's east corner, a voice. 4 of you. She knew the voice, Rourke. 7 of us, he continued. You want to count again? She didn't take her eyes off the men in front of her. But in her peripheral vision, she saw movement shapes emerging from the darkness beyond the fence. Dale Hargrove, his oldest son, 2 of the foster men. And behind them, carrying a second rifle she didn't know he had, Caleb Weller, 13 years old, standing in the cold night in his boots and coat with the specific rigid calm of a boy who has decided he is not moving. The 4 men in the yard looked at each other. The one nearest the house made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite anything, and stepped back. This isn't finished, he said, to Miriam, to the yard. To no one in particular. Not yet, Miriam agreed. But tonight it is. Leave. They left. She stood on the porch until the sound of them was gone completely. Then she let the rifle down slowly, both hands, and turned around. Rourke was walking toward the porch. He looked road-worn and exhausted in the way of someone who'd been riding hard, which she found out later. He'd pushed back from Lincoln in 3 days instead of 4. Something about the attorney's message having a particular urgency that made him unwilling to spend another night on the road. Hargroves and the Fosters came in through the gate. Dale Hargrove had mud on his boots and the expression of a man who'd been waiting for something to do and was glad to finally be doing it. Caleb stood a few feet from Rourke. He looked at his uncle. Then, slowly, he walked past him and stopped beside Miriam instead. He stood there next to her, facing the empty yard, the rifle still in his hands. Are they going to come back? He asked. Not tonight, Miriam said. But they will, probably. He was quiet for a moment. Then we need to be ready, Caleb said. Behind them, the kitchen light was on, and Hannah was in the window, with Nell pressed against her side, and Maisie was crying upstairs with the full-throated complaint of a healthy baby who'd been disturbed. And in the barn, the gray horse was moving restlessly, and the creek was running in the dark. They'd held the night. But Miriam knew, as she stood on that porch in the cold, that holding one night meant nothing if they couldn't hold what came after. Rourke came to stand beside her. He was carrying the oilskin pouch. The attorney in Lincoln, he said quietly. He's seen the deed. He's seen the survey. He says the water rights case is strong. He paused. But he needs more. He needs the neighbor testimony. The payment records. He needs to show a pattern. I have it, Miriam said. Everything the neighbors gave me. He says with all of it together, he can go to the state land office. Request an emergency review. It won't happen in 24 days. Miriam looked at him. The mortgage deadline, Rourke said. He says we need to file for a stay of enforcement while the review is underway. But we need to file it in the county court and the county clerk. Is Vanes, Miriam said. Yes, she stood with that problem for a moment. Then we file it through the district court in the next county, she said. Is that possible? Rourke thought. It's not the standard way. Is it possible? Legally, yes, if we can make the case for local bias in the handling. We can make that case, Miriam said. I've got 2 years of evidence that the local land office has been mishandling anything that goes against Vane's interest. She looked at the yard, empty now, the night quiet again. Get inside and sleep for 4 hours. I need you functional. And then we write every rancher in this valley a letter, Miriam said. And we bring all of them here, because the attorney in Lincoln is right. He needs the pattern. We're going to give him the whole picture. She went back inside. Nell was at the bottom of the stairs. The men are gone? Nell asked. Gone, Miriam said. Are you scared? Miriam looked at her for a moment, this small, direct, absolutely fearless child who asked every question the rest of them were afraid to ask. Yes, Miriam said honestly. Nell thought about this. Papa used to say scared just means you care about what happens, Nell said. Miriam stood very still for a moment. Your papa, she said quietly, was a smart man. Nell nodded with complete certainty. I know. She went back upstairs. Miriam stood in the front room of the Weller Ranch. In the cold, with the clock above the mantelpiece ticking, and 24 days left on a mortgage she was now certain had been designed from the beginning to take this land, and an oil flask abandoned in her yard by men who'd come to burn her out, and a folder full of evidence that she was going to have to turn into something powerful enough to stop a man who'd never once expected to be stopped. She sat down at Jonas's desk. She picked up her pen. She began to write. The letters went out the next morning. Miriam had written 11 of them by lamplight, one for each ranch family that had agreed to participate, and 4 more for families she hadn't yet approached, but whose names had come up repeatedly in her conversations, people who'd been hurt by Vane but hadn't known there was anything to join. She wrote each letter by hand, the same hand that had written careful correspondence to Jonas Weller across 400 miles, and she made each one specific. Not a general peal, not a speech. She named what she knew about each family's situation, what she needed from them, and when she needed them at the Weller Ranch. Caleb rode out to deliver them before breakfast. He didn't ask if he should. He just took the stack from her hand, sorted them by direction, and went. She watched him ride out through the gate and thought about the boy who'd sat across from her on the train platform and told her she could take the next train east. Boy still existed inside this one. But there was something growing over him, something harder and more deliberate, that was either going to turn into a good man or a very tired one. And she was doing her best to make sure it went the right direction. Rourke had slept 4 hours on the barn floor, which she'd told him to do, and woke looking marginally better than a man who'd ridden 300 miles in 3 days deserved to look. He came into the kitchen, drank 2 cups of coffee without speaking, and then said, "Tell me what you need from me today," she told him. He spent the morning building a clear, organized summary of the water rights evidence, not for the neighbors, who didn't need the legal architecture explained, but for the district court filing, they were going to need to buy time on the mortgage. He worked at the kitchen table with the document spread around him and a sharpness of concentration that she'd come to recognize as his natural mode, the thing that happened when he had a specific problem and specific tools. Meanwhile, Miriam went to see Margaret Hargrove, not for support, not for sympathy. She needed to know something she'd been turning over since the night of the torches, something that had been nagging at her since Rourke told her the attorney needed the pattern, not just individual incidents. The man who collected the water fees, she said, sitting across from Margaret at her kitchen table. What did he look like? Did you ever learn his name? Young man, maybe 25, fair hair. He came out from Vane's main property. His name, she paused. Walt Giddens. He worked for Vane about 3 years. Past tense. I heard he left Vane's employ maybe 6 months ago. There was talk, but there's always talk. Where is he now? Somebody said he was working at the feed store in town. Jerry Callum's place. Margaret studied Miriam. Why? Because a man who collected illegal water fees for 3 years and then left his employer in a hurry might have a reason to want someone to know what he did and why, Miriam said. And he's the only person I know of who can directly connect the fee collection to Vane's personal direction. Margaret was quiet for a moment. You want him to testify. I want to know if he will. She rode to town that afternoon. Feed store was a single-story building that smelled of grain dust and leather and the specific warm smell of working animals. A young man behind the counter, fair-haired, mid-20s, with the wary look of someone who's learned to be careful, looked up when she came in. Walt Giddens? Miriam asked. The wariness sharpened. Who's asking? My name is Miriam Langford. I'm staying at the Weller Ranch. She watched his face. Something moved in it at the ranch's name, not surprise, something more complicated. Recognition. Maybe even something like relief, which she hadn't expected. I think you might know why I'm here. He looked around the store. The other man behind the counter, older, Jerry Callum himself, she assumed was at the far end moving sacks. Giddens looked back at her. I know why you're here, he said quietly. Will you talk to me? He was quiet for a long moment. He was doing the calculation she'd seen on Dale Hargrove's face, and Ruth Foster's face, and on the face of nearly everyone she'd approached the calculation between risk and conscience, between self-protection and the thing that happened inside you when you'd done something you weren't comfortable with, and someone finally showed up and gave you a reason to do something about it. Not here, he said, tonight, behind the livery, 7 o'clock. She was there at 7. Giddens came alone. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders slightly hunched, the posture of a man who's carrying something heavy and has been for a while. I collected those fees for 2 years and 8 months, he said, without preamble. I knew they weren't legitimate. I knew, because when I asked Vane to show me the deed that covered the water rights, he had his lawyer tell me it was complicated, and I should stop asking questions. He paused. That's when I knew something was wrong. If the deed was clean, there's no reason not to show it to the man you've hired to collect fees on its behalf. Why did you stay? Miriam asked. He didn't look at her. Money. He paid well. And I told myself the ranchers were paying it, so they must believe it was legitimate, so maybe I was wrong about the deed. He stopped. That's a lie I told myself for 2 years and 8 months. What made you leave? He told me to do something else. His jaw tightened. I won't say what it was, but it was something I couldn't do and sleep at night. So I left. He finally looked at her. I've been waiting for someone to come asking. I wasn't going to go looking for trouble, but if someone came asking, I'm asking, Miriam said. I know. He took a breath. I'll testify. I've got records of my own dates, amounts, ranches. I kept records because I thought someday I might need them. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. Every collection, every ranch, every amount. 2 years and 8 months. Miriam took the paper. She looked at the list. It was comprehensive in a way that made her chest tight, not because it was worse than she'd expected, but because it was exactly as bad as she'd suspected. And seeing it written down in someone else's hand, a hand that had been part of it, made it real in a way that her own documents hadn't quite. Can you be at the Weller Ranch in 3 days? She asked. Yes. Bring your records, bring whatever else you have. And Mr. Giddens, she folded the paper and put it with the others. Thank you. He shook his head slightly. Don't thank me yet. Vane's going to know who talked. I know, she said. We'll deal with that. She rode back to the ranch in the dark and added Giddens's list to the folder. The gathering happened on a Thursday, 3 days later, in the Weller yard. 12 families came, some she'd written to, some who'd heard from neighbors and come without being asked. They came in wagons and on horseback, and one family, the Chadwicks, from the north end of the valley, whom she hadn't known about at all, came on foot because they'd sold their horses 2 months earlier to make a payment on a debt to Vane that they now understood was fraudulent. Miriam had set up the yard as best she could. Benches from inside the house, chairs borrowed from the Hargroves, the wagon tailgates used as surfaces for spreading papers. It wasn't a courthouse and it wasn't a meeting hall. It was a ranch yard with a sagging porch and a barn that still had scorch marks where the torches had been held near the wall, and she left the scorch marks visible on purpose. She stood in front of all of them and told them everything. Not in speeches, she had no taste for speeches, but in facts. What Jonas had found, what the deed said, what the survey showed, what the water rights law said about it, what the attorney in Lincoln had concluded from the documents Rourke had brought him, what Walt Giddens had confirmed about the fee collection, what the partial dam on the creek represented as a legal action, and what it meant for everyone south of the Weller property if Vane completed it. She didn't tell them what to feel about it. She didn't have to. The Chadwick man, his name was Frank, and he was a quiet person who'd said almost nothing since they arrived, stood up when she finished. My family has been paying water fees for 2 years, he said. We paid it because we thought we had to. We had to sell horses to cover it. He stopped. He had the voice of a man who doesn't speak in public often and is finding it harder than he expected. I want to know what it takes to get that money back. That's one of the things we're fighting for, Miriam said. But I need your records, whatever you have documenting the payments. I have them, Frank Chadwick said. I kept everything. My wife said to keep everything. Your wife was right. That produced something in the yard, not laughter exactly, but a loosening. The specific kind of loosening that happens when people who've been carrying a weight alone discover that everyone around them has been carrying the same weight. The records they produced that afternoon were extraordinary, not because any individual document was dramatic, but because of the accumulation. Receipts, letters, ledgers, dates and amounts recorded in different handwriting across different farms across several years. When Miriam spread them on the wagon tailgate and began organizing them, the picture that emerged was not one man abusing one contract. It was a systematic operation, methodical, patient, specifically designed to extract money and eventually land from people who couldn't fight back because they'd been kept too isolated to know they weren't alone. Rourke sat beside her and helped sort. He had a surveyor's mind for organization. He created a chronological sequence of the fee collection, matched it against the land office records she'd obtained, showed where dates aligned with Vane's manipulation of filing processes that should have protected the very families he was extracting money from. By late afternoon, they had something, not a finished case that was the attorney's job, but the material of one, the bones of it. Miriam looked at the yard full of people who'd come, and the papers spread before her, and felt for the first time since she'd read that mortgage document something that wasn't just determination, something that was faintly, cautiously like hope. Then Dale Hargrove said, "From the far end of the yard, Vane's man is on the road." Everyone turned. A single rider stopped at the property gate. He wasn't coming in. He was just sitting there watching the yard, looking at the crowd of people, the papers, the organized chaos of a community doing something together. Nobody moved for a moment. "He's counting us," Caleb said from beside Miriam. She looked at him. "He's counting how many families came," Caleb said. "So he can tell Vane." He was right. The rider stayed for perhaps 2 minutes, long enough to see everything there was to see, and then turned and rode back north. The yard was quiet. "He's going to know," Ruth Foster said. "It wasn't a question. He already suspected," Miriam said. "Now he knows. It doesn't change what we do next." She looked at the faces around her, anxious, some of them. Angry, most of them. Tired, all of them. "What we do next is get this documentation to Lincoln before the court deadline. Rourke leaves tomorrow morning. Anyone who wants to add to what we have, bring it to the house tonight." 3 people came that evening with additional materials. One of them was the Lindqvist family, who'd refused to participate when she'd first asked. Mrs. Lindqvist came alone, without her husband, and stood on the porch and held out a small bundle of receipts. "He wouldn't come," she said, "but he said I could." Miriam took the receipts. "It counts," she said. Rourke left at dawn with everything packed in 2 oilskin pouches, this time one for the attorney, one for the state land office directly, which the attorney in Lincoln had told him was now the right move given the scope of what they had. Miriam watched him ride out with the uncomfortable awareness that she'd put everything in motion and now had to wait, which was the part of any hard situation she'd always found most difficult. She was good at doing. Waiting made everything louder. The mortgage deadline was 16 days away. The stay of enforcement application had been filed with the district court. In the next county, Emmett Crane had done it, quietly, citing local bias in the handling of land matters, which he could cite with professional confidence because he'd been watching it happen for 3 years. The court had acknowledged receipt. There was no guarantee they'd grant it in time. Vane's response came sooner than she expected. 2 days after Rourke left, she received a visit from a man she hadn't seen before, a lawyer from Omaha named Hardcastle, well-dressed, with the smooth manner of someone accustomed to rooms where everyone already agrees with him. He arrived with a formal letter from Vane's legal office and an offer that was dressed up in polite language, but was, at its core, very simple. Sell the ranch. Accept a settlement that would pay off the mortgage and leave enough for the children's immediate welfare. Sign the papers within 10 days. "What happens to the children?" Miriam asked. Hardcastle smiled the smile of someone for whom this question has an administrative answer. "Arrangements would be made. There are institutions that handle." "No," Miriam said, "Miss Langford, the legal position." "I know the legal position," Miriam said. "I've had it explained to me by 2 attorneys in the last month. What I know, that you apparently don't, is that the basis for this mortgage's death clause is being reviewed at the state level, along with approximately 3 years of fraudulent water fee collection affecting 14 families in this valley." She paused. "Your client's legal position is not as solid as he's told you it is." Something shifted in Hardcastle's smooth manner. A small shift, but she saw it. "I'd advise you," he said, "carefully, not to make accusations you can't support." "I'm not making accusations," Miriam said. "I'm making statements of fact." "There's a difference." She stood up. "I'm not signing anything. If Mr. Vane wants to discuss a resolution that doesn't involve orphaning 8 children or stealing a valley's water supply, he can contact Emmett Crane. Otherwise, we'll see each other in court." Hardcastle left. Miriam sat back down. Her hands were shaking slightly. She put them flat on the desk and waited for them to stop. Hannah appeared in the doorway. "Was that a lawyer?" she asked. "Yes." "What did he want?" "He wanted us to give up," Miriam said. Hannah stood in the doorway for a moment. She was 13 now. She'd had a birthday 2 weeks ago, which they'd marked with a small cake that Nell had been passionately involved in making, and which had turned out lopsided and slightly dense and had been eaten completely anyway. "Are we going to?" Hannah asked. "No," Miriam said. Hannah nodded. She went back to the kitchen. 8 days later, 2 things happened on the same afternoon, roughly 2 hours apart, that changed the shape of everything. The first was that the man from the attempted arson, one of the 4 who'd come to the barn that night with oil and torches, came to the ranch alone and asked to speak to Miriam. His name was Cole Arden. He was perhaps 30, with the look of a man who'd slept badly for weeks. He sat in the front room and told her, without her having to ask for very much, that Thaddeus Vane had personally ordered the arson attempt. He named the other 3 men. He described the conversation in which Vane had given the order, including the specific phrase Vane had used, "I don't care how you do it. Just make sure that ranch isn't viable by morning." "Why are you telling me this?" Miriam asked. Arden looked at the floor. "Because my sister's husband has a ranch south of here, and he's been paying those water fees. Because I didn't know what I was getting into when I went to work for Vane, and then I did know, and then I did what I did anyway. And there's a limit to how long you can do that before you can't look at yourself anymore." He looked up. "I'll say it in front of a judge, whatever you need." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. "You know what happens when you do," she said. "Vane will know it was you." "Yes, ma'am. And you still want to?" "I already said so," he said. Miriam sent him to Emmett Crane with a note explaining who he was and what he'd told her. The second thing happened at 3 in the afternoon, when a rider came from the district court with papers for Emmett Crane, copies of which were delivered to Miriam at the ranch. The stay of enforcement had been granted. The mortgage deadline was suspended pending the outcome of the State Land Office review and the district court's examination of the death clause enforceability. Vane could not seize the ranch, not yet, not while the review was active. Miriam read the document 3 times. She set it on the desk. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen doorway. "Hannah," she said. Hannah looked up from the bread she was working. "Get everyone in for supper," Miriam said. "Everyone. Tell Caleb to come in from the pasture. Tell Rourke." She stopped. Rourke was still in Lincoln. "Tell the children. Supper tonight." "Is something good happening?" Nell asked, from behind Hannah, because Nell was always behind Hannah. Miriam looked at her. "Something is happening," she said carefully. "Whether it's good depends on what comes next." Nell seemed to find this an acceptable answer. That night, the state investigator arrived. His name was Aldrich Boone, and he came from the Land Commissioner's office in Lincoln. And he came with 2 men and a set of credentials that made Emmett Crane's eyebrows rise when he saw them. The attorney in Lincoln had moved faster than Miriam, had dared to hope the scope of the documentation, apparently, had persuaded the commissioner's office that this wasn't a local dispute, but a systematic pattern requiring direct intervention. Boone was a compact man in his 50s with a gray beard and the efficient manner of someone who's investigated enough fraud to stop being surprised by it and start simply cataloging it. He sat at Jonas's desk. She gave it to him. It felt right and went through every document in the folder with the methodical attention of someone doing a job, not performing one. He asked questions, specific technical questions about dates and survey marks and the specific language of the mortgage clause. He asked about the water fees and who had paid them and when. He asked about the arson attempt and whether she had a witness, and when she told him about Cole Arden and his willingness to testify, something shifted slightly in Boone's efficient expression. "That," Boone said, "is significant." "I thought it might be," Miriam said. One man's testimony about an arson order, combined with this volume of documentation on the land fraud that's not a civil matter anymore. He set down the paper he was holding. "Miss Langford, I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "How did you come to have all of this? The folder, the survey, the deed Jonas Weller died a month ago. You arrived expecting to marry a man you'd never met. How did you end up at the center of this?" Miriam considered the question. "I didn't have anywhere else to be," she said finally. Boone looked at her for a moment. "That's not a complete answer," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's the honest one. He spent 3 days at the ranch, going through everything, taking copies, interviewing the neighbors who came when Miriam sent word. He interviewed Dale and Margaret Hargrove. He interviewed Ruth Foster. He interviewed Frank Chadwick, who came with his wife this time. He interviewed Walt Giddens, who drove out from town with his records and sat across from Boone with the direct, uncomfortable honesty of a man paying a debt he'd owed for a while. He interviewed Cole Arden in a closed room with a written statement prepared by Emmett Crane. He met with Rourke, who returned from Lincoln on the second day of Boone's visit, with a letter from the Lincoln attorney that was apparently detailed enough to make Boone read it twice. On the third day, Boone called Miriam into the front room. "Here's what I can tell you," he said. "The water rights claim is fraudulent. The survey evidence is clear, and the deed predates Vane's claim by 11 years. The death clause in the mortgage was drafted with the specific intent to trigger on Jonas Weller's death. We found a similar clause in 2 other mortgages Vane holds in this county, which suggests pattern rather than coincidence. The water fee collection constitutes fraud, and the arson order, if Arden's testimony holds up, constitutes criminal conspiracy. He paused. I'm going to recommend to the Commissioner's office that this be referred to the State Attorney General. Miriam was quiet for a moment. What does that mean for the ranch? She asked. It means enforcement of the mortgage is suspended indefinitely while the criminal investigation is active. Vane cannot touch this property. He looked at her steadily. It doesn't mean the mortgage disappears. The debt is still real. But the terms and the death clause will be reviewed by the district court, and given what we've found about how the contract was drafted, I'd expect significant modification. And the water fees, repayment proceedings will be initiated. He paused. The legal machinery is slow, but it starts. Miriam sat with that, the slow machinery starting. Not a rescue, not a dramatic reversal, but the beginning of a process that had weight and teeth and official backing for the first time. She nodded. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Boone said with something that might have been the beginning of a dry smile. Thank whoever built that folder. That evening, after Boone and his men had gone to town to take rooms at the hotel, Miriam sat on the porch in the cold. Caleb came out and sat on the step below her, which was his particular way of being near someone without being too near. They sat in silence for a while. Is it over? Caleb asked. No, Miriam said. It's beginning to be over, which is different. He was quiet. Are we going to keep the ranch? He asked. Miriam looked at the yard, the gate, the road north toward Copper Hollow, the barn with its repaired boards, the south pasture where the cattle were doing better than they'd been doing a month ago. The fence line that Rourke had spent 3 weeks repairing post by post without being asked twice. Yes, she said. Caleb absorbed this. How do you know? He asked. She thought about it. Because your father knew it was worth fighting for, she said. And he was right. And now there are enough people who know what Vane did that it can't be buried anymore. She paused. And because when people stop being afraid enough to show up and tell the truth, when there are enough of them, it gets very hard for a man like Vane to operate. He counted on everyone staying separate, staying scared. Staying quiet, she looked at Caleb. You saw the yard last week. That's not quiet. Caleb stared at the gate for a moment. He's going to try something else, Caleb said. Probably, Miriam said. Men like him usually do, and we'll deal with it, she said. The way we've dealt with everything else. One problem at a time. He sat with that. The creek was running somewhere below the pasture, audible in the still night air, the same sound it had made every night since she arrived, steady and indifferent and permanent. After a while, Caleb said, You're not what I expected. Miriam looked at him. When you got off the train, he said. He was looking at the gate, not at her. I thought you'd be like the other women who'd written to Papa. He got 3 letters before yours. 2 of them wrote like they were applying for a position. One of them wrote like she was doing him a favor. He paused. You took over. Not like you were taking something. You were picking something up that got dropped. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Your father's letters told me who he was, she said. Honest men are rarer than people think. When I found one, I wasn't going to be careless about it. She stopped. I'm sorry I didn't get to meet him. Caleb's jaw worked. He would have liked you, he said. He wouldn't have said so right away. He was slow about saying things, but he would have. Inside the house, someone, Nell, from the sound of it, dropped something and then immediately began explaining to Hannah why it wasn't her fault. Twins laughed. Thomas told everyone to be quiet. Maisie, who had recently discovered that she could pull herself to standing using the side of the crib, made the sound she made when she was doing something she was proud of. Caleb almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Miriam looked at the night and the gate and the road and let herself feel, just for a moment, the weight of what was still ahead and the small, difficult, imperfect thing they had managed to build in the middle of it. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was ground they were standing on. And for tonight, that was enough. The ground they were standing on turned out to be less stable than that night on the porch had made it feel. Boone's investigation moved with the deliberate, grinding pace of official machinery, which is to say it moved slower than Miriam wanted and faster than Vane had anticipated. And the space between those 2 facts was where the next 2 months of her life were lived. The stay of enforcement held. The mortgage deadline passed without consequence passed, like any other Tuesday. Caleb doing the cattle ledger at the kitchen table, and the twins fighting over a wooden toy, and Maisie pulling herself to standing at the crib rail and looking immensely pleased with herself. Miriam had half expected something dramatic to market. There was nothing. Just another day the ranch was still theirs. Vane did try something else, as Caleb had predicted. He tried it through lawyers first. Hardcastle came back twice more, with variations on the same offer, each time dressed in slightly different language, each time declined in the same clear terms. Then Vane filed a counter-complaint with the county land office challenging the validity of the old deed, Jonas's deed, the one with Aldous Pren's surveyor mark in the corner, on the grounds that the original registration had procedural irregularities. Emmett Crane read the counter-complaint and made the expression of a man who has been doing this long enough to recognize the smell of desperation dressed as legal strategy. "He's stalling," Crane said. "This challenge has no merit." Pren's surveys were registered with the territorial office, not the county. The county land office has no jurisdiction to challenge them. He knows that. His lawyer knows that. He set the papers down. He's hoping the cost of responding wears you out before the state investigation concludes. "How much does responding cost?" Miriam asked. Crane named a number that was not comfortable. She looked at her ledger. At the cattle numbers Caleb had been maintaining with increasing competence. At the household accounts she'd been managing with the particular discipline of someone who knows that every dollar has exactly one place it can go. "Do it," she said. "Miriam, do it. We'll find the money." She closed the ledger. He does not get to win through exhaustion. They found the money the way people find money when they have to imperfectly and from several directions at once. Ruth Foster sent a contribution without being asked, tucked inside a note that said only, "For whatever it costs. We're in this together." Dale Hargrove came by with a small amount in cash and the information that 3 other families had done the same. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't dignified, and Miriam hated needing it, but she took it because pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, and because refusing help when it was genuinely offered was its own kind of foolishness. The counter-complaint was answered. The county land office declined to proceed with it, citing the jurisdictional issue Crane had identified. Vane's stalling tactic cost him more than it cost them, because it produced a written record of attempted interference with an active state investigation that Boone's office found very useful. That was in November. Cole Arden testified before the state investigator in December. Miriam wasn't present for it. It happened in Lincoln, in a formal proceeding she wasn't party to, but Rourke was, having been called as a material witness on the surveying questions. He came back on a gray afternoon 3 days before Christmas with snow threatening and the specific quiet of a man who has sat in a room where hard things were said and said them. Arden held up, Rourke told her. He didn't flinch. He gave every detail the order, the words Vane used, the names of the other 3 men. He paused. Vane's lawyer tried to discredit him. Went after his employment history, suggested he was motivated by personal grievance. He looked at her. Arden just said he was there, and he heard what he heard, and he knew what he knew. There's not a lot you can do with a man who's decided to tell the truth and doesn't care what it costs him. Walt Giddens testified the same week. His records, the 2 years and 8 months of collection entries he'd kept in a plain ledger, were entered into the formal proceeding as documentary evidence. When Vane's lawyers challenged the authenticity of the records, Giddens produced the original receipt book he'd been issued by Vane's operation, with Vane's own company letterhead on the cover. That, apparently, was the moment the proceeding changed temperature. Miriam heard about it through Rourke, who'd heard it from the Lincoln attorney, who'd been present. Vane's lead lawyer had asked for a recess after the receipt book was produced. The recess had lasted 2 hours. When the proceeding resumed, the aggressive posture of Vane's legal team had changed to something more careful and measured, which was the legal equivalent of a man who's been running hard suddenly becoming very interested in walking slowly. Back in Copper Hollow, winter settled in over the valley, and the children grew, and the ranch worked the way a ranch works in cold months, harder in some ways, quieter in others. Miriam learned things she hadn't known about managing cattle through a Nebraska winter, some of it from Rourke, more of it from doing and getting it wrong and doing it again. She pulled a calf through a difficult birth in February by herself because Rourke was fixing the north fence line and Caleb was in town and there was no one else. And it was one of the least dignified experiences of her life, and the calf survived, and she didn't tell anyone the full story of how messy it had been. The children had stopped being strangers to her somewhere around October, so gradually that she couldn't identify the moment it happened. Hannah had started consulting her on household decisions rather than just informing her of them. Thomas had developed the habit of telling her things about the cattle that she suspected he'd previously only told Jonas, because he'd decided she was a person who would take the information seriously. The twins had given up trying to determine whether she was a figure of authority and simply treated her as a fixed feature of the landscape, which was actually more comfortable. Lucy, who'd been the most watchful and the most silent of all of them in those first weeks, had gradually begun a running commentary on the world that she apparently delivered exclusively to Miriam, and that covered everything from the behavior of the barn cat to her opinions on Thomas's character. Maisie learned to walk in January. Her first 3 steps were toward Miriam, which was an accident of positioning rather than preference. But Miriam felt it anyway. Nell remained exactly who she'd been the first night: direct, fearless, constitutionally incapable of asking anything other than the question she actually wanted to ask. "Do you love us?" Nell asked, one evening in February, sitting beside Miriam at the kitchen table while Miriam was working the accounts. Miriam looked at her. "Yes," she said. Nell nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the drawing she'd been making of what she claimed was a horse, but which looked more like a rectangle with legs. "Do you love Rourke?" Nell asked, without looking up. Miriam set her pen down. "That's a different question," she said. "I know," Nell said. "That's why I'm asking it." Miriam looked at the accounts, at the numbers she'd been working, at the ledger that was slowly moving in a better direction than it had been moving when she'd first opened it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Nell considered this. "He looks at you like he knows," Nell said. Miriam picked up her pen and said nothing else. And Nell, who had the remarkable quality of knowing when she'd said enough, returned to her rectangle horse without pushing further. The state attorney general's findings came in March. Miriam was in the barn when Emmett Crane rode out with the documents, and she came in from the cold with her hands dirty and hay in her hair and read the official summary standing at Jonas's desk while Crane sat across from her and watched her face. The findings were comprehensive. Thaddeus Vane had engaged in systematic mortgage fraud across 14 properties in Copper Hollow and 2 adjacent counties. He had operated an illegal water fee scheme targeting at minimum 17 ranch families over a period of nearly 3 years. He had manipulated county land office filings to suppress legitimate appeals. He had directed a criminal conspiracy to commit arson against the Weller property. The fraudulent death clause in the Weller mortgage and at least 2 others had been drafted with specific predatory intent and was declared unenforceable. The criminal charges were being filed separately, Crane explained. The civil findings would proceed to remediation, which meant the repayment of fraudulent fees, the restructuring of affected mortgages, and the formal invalidation of the water claim. What happens to it? Crane adjusted his spectacles. The death clause is gone. The interest rate is being reviewed. Given how the contract was drafted, the district court will likely reduce it significantly. The remaining principal will be restructured on terms the ranch can actually service. He paused. You won't pay it off next year, probably not in 3 years. But it's a debt you can carry without it killing you. Miriam, read that section of the document again. A debt you can carry without it killing you. She'd take it. And the water rights? She asked. The creek remains exactly where it is, flowing exactly as it has always flowed, under the prior appropriation rights documented in Jonas's deed. Vane's claim is formally voided. The dam structure on the old Pruett property, which was never completed, has been ordered removed at Vane's expense. Crane almost smiled. The water belongs to the valley. Miriam set the document down on the desk. She stood there for a moment. She thought about Jonas Weller, who'd written honest letters to a woman he'd never met, because honesty was the only currency he trusted. Who'd spent the last months of his life quietly collecting evidence against a man who was stealing a valley's water, knowing the county couldn't help him, and trying to find a path that could. Who'd written to a brother he'd been estranged from for 13 years, because he needed someone who knew the land and the law, and he was running out of time. Jonas had not lived to see this morning. That fact did not get easier with time. She'd stopped expecting it to. "Thank you, Emmett," she said. Crane nodded. He gathered his papers. At the door, he stopped. Jonas would have been. He stopped himself, started again. He was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him. "I'm glad someone finished what he started." He left. Miriam stood alone in the front room for a few minutes. Then she went out to find the children. They were scattered across the property in the way children are on a cold March morning, Caleb and Rourke at the south fence, Hannah in the kitchen, Thomas and Eli in the pasture, Lucy and the twins somewhere near the barn, Nell sitting on the porch step doing something with a piece of rope, Maisie inside with Hannah because it was too cold for a 14-month-old to be outside. Miriam gathered them. She told them plainly and without ceremony, standing in the yard with the cold still on her coat from the barn. She told them the mortgage terms were changing. She told them Vane's water claim was void. She told them the ranch was theirs not free and clear, not without work, but theirs to keep and build on without the threat of someone taking it away for reasons that had never been legitimate. The children received this information in the specific way. Children receive large news, processing it at different speeds, in different registers, with different expressions. Thomas said, "So we're keeping the cattle?" "Yes," Miriam said. "All of them?" "All of them. And we're going to add more in the spring." Thomas nodded with the satisfaction of a boy for whom cattle are the primary unit of measurement of how things are going. Eli wanted to know if this meant they could fix the barn roof, which had been leaking at the east corner since January. "Yes," Miriam said. "That's on the list." The twins understood mainly that something good had happened and responded by running in a circle, which was their standard response to strong emotion of any kind. Lucy stood next to Miriam and took her hand without saying anything, which was the most Lucy thing Lucy had ever done, and which Miriam felt somewhere behind her sternum. Hannah, who was standing slightly apart, with her arms crossed, said quietly, "Is it really done?" "The worst of it," Miriam said. "There will still be proceedings. Lawyers and filings and things we'll have to respond to. It won't be completely finished for a while." She looked at Hannah steadily. "But Vane can't touch this ranch. That's done." Hannah uncrossed her arms. She looked at the yard, the gate, the road. She looked at the fence line Rourke had spent weeks repairing. She looked at the barn and the south pasture and the kitchen garden that was still bare but would be planted in 2 months. She was looking at the ranch the way someone looks at something they'd been afraid to love too much in case it got taken away, and now were allowing themselves to love fully for the first time. "Okay," Hannah said. That was all, but the way she said it made it enough. Nell had been quiet through all of this, sitting on the porch step with her rope, watching. When Miriam looked at her, she said, "What about Rourke?" Everyone looked at Rourke, who had come in from the fence line during Miriam's account and was standing at the edge of the group with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who is trying to determine whether he belongs in a moment or at the edges of it. "What about him?" Miriam asked. "Is he staying?" Nell asked. The yard was quiet. Rourke looked at Nell. Then he looked at Caleb, which was the more significant look, because Caleb was the one whose answer actually mattered in a way that went past practicality. Caleb had his arms crossed. He was looking at the south fence line that he and Rourke had repaired together. Post by post, over the course of 3 weeks, during which they'd talked mostly about cattle and sometimes about nothing, and very occasionally, in the specific way of men doing physical work side by side, about things that mattered. "That's his question to answer," Caleb said. He looked at Rourke directly, which was something he'd been doing more often lately, with less effort than it had once required. "Not mine." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to stay," he said. "If there's a place for me." Caleb looked at the fence line again. "You rebuilt that whole south section," he said. "That's not the work of a man planning to leave. It wasn't forgiveness, not the full, clean version of it. Forgiveness like that takes longer than 6 months, and neither of them would have trusted it if it had come quicker. But it was something honest, something that acknowledged what had been done and what was being done now, and allowed for the possibility that a person could be more than their worst decision." Rourke nodded once. Nell looked satisfied. The way Nell looked when something she'd already worked out in her head was confirmed by events. The formal proceedings against Vane moved through the spring with the grinding momentum of legal machinery that has finally found its teeth. He had money and lawyers and political connections, and he used all of them, and none of them were enough because the evidence was too comprehensive, and the number of people willing to testify was too large. When a man's operation depends on isolation, on keeping each victim separate, each family thinking they're the only one, too ashamed or too afraid to look left or right, and see that everyone around them is carrying the same weight the moment that isolation breaks, the operation doesn't just weaken, it collapses. The county clerk was removed from office in April following the investigation's findings about manipulated filings. He was not prosecuted. There wasn't enough direct evidence of his personal participation versus willful negligence, but he was removed, and a new clerk was appointed by the district court. And the land office began working the way land offices are supposed to work, which made a noticeable difference to everyone who'd spent years watching their legitimate filings go nowhere. 3 of the 4 men from the arson attempt were charged. Cole Arden, who had testified, received consideration from the court. Other 2 received consequences. The 4th man, the one who'd circled behind Miriam on the porch that night, was never definitively identified, which bothered Miriam for a while and then bothered her less as time passed and other things required her attention. Vane himself faced both criminal and civil proceedings. The criminal case moved slowly, as criminal cases do, and was not resolved by summer. But his mortgages were reviewed. His fraudulent water claim was voided with full legal finality. The families who'd been paying water fees for years began receiving repayment through a remediation process that was imperfect, slower than it should have been, partial in some cases where Vane's liquid assets were tied up in the proceedings, but real. Frank and Ada Chadwick received enough to replace the horses they'd sold. The Fosters received the full amount of their 18 months of payments. The Hargroves received theirs with interest, which Dale Hargrove said he hadn't expected, and which Margaret Hargrove said was the least they deserved. The creek kept running. The dam that had been half built on the old Pruitt property was dismantled in May by a work crew paid from Vane's held assets, and when the last of it was cleared and the water ran unobstructed again, 3 ranchers from the south end of the valley rode out to watch it happen and then went home without saying much, because there are things that are better witnessed quietly. Rourke asked Miriam to marry him on an evening in late June. They were on the porch that had been repaired in April, the sagging left side jacked up and re-leveled, which was one of 23 specific improvements. Miriam had kept on a list and been working through systematically, and the children were inside, and the evening was warm, and the creek was audible below the south pasture, and he asked her without build-up or ceremony, which was how she would have wanted it if she'd thought to specify. She'd known it was coming, not because he'd signaled it, obviously, but because she'd been paying attention, and she'd been paying attention because Nell had been right about the way he looked at her. And somewhere between February and June, she'd stopped being uncertain about her own answer. She said yes. She said it plainly and without drama, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given something he wasn't entirely sure he deserved, and intends to be careful with it. And that expression told her more about who he was than anything else he could have said. They told the children that night. The range of reactions was characteristic. Thomas wanted to know if this changed anything about the cattle operation. Eli wanted to know if Rourke would keep sleeping in the barn, which he'd continued to do from habit even after the formal arrangement became informal. And when told that no, Rourke would be in the house. Eli said good with the practicality of a boy who'd been doing Rourke's share of the morning barn chores out of misplaced guilt and was relieved to stop. The twins reacted by running in a circle. Lucy said, "I knew," with the quiet authority of someone stating a fact. Hannah looked at Miriam for a long moment and then said, "You're sure?" And when Miriam said yes, Hannah said good. He's good with the cattle, which was Hannah's version of a blessing. Caleb said nothing for a moment. He looked at Rourke. "You'll be her husband," Caleb said. "You won't be our father." "I know that," Rourke said. "I'm not saying it to be cruel," Caleb said. "I'm saying it because I know the difference, and I need to know you know it too." "Jonas was your father," Rourke said. "He was my brother, and I failed him in ways I can't make right. I'm not trying to replace what he was. I'm trying to be useful to what's here now." Caleb absorbed this. "Okay," he said, like Hannah's okay, simple and sufficient and meaning more than it said. Nell said, "So now you're really staying." And Miriam smiled and said, "I was staying long before today." The wedding was held in the ranch yard on a Saturday in August, which was the same month Miriam had arrived the previous year and felt like the right kind of symmetry. The neighbors came, the Hargroves and the Fosters and the Chats and the Chadwicks and families she'd come to know over the course of a year that had remade every understanding she'd had of what her life was going to look like. Emmett Crane came, uncomfortable in his good suit. Walt Giddens came, standing at the back of the gathering with his hands in his pockets, and Miriam caught his eye at one point and he nodded back, and that was enough. Nell held Miriam's hand through the ceremony. The twins sat still for approximately 4 minutes before needing to be occupied by Lucy, who handled this with the resigned efficiency of someone who'd been managing twins for 7 years. Maisie sat in Hannah's arms and watched everything with the solemn, interested attention of a child who is absorbing the world without yet having words for it. Caleb stood beside Rourke, which was where a best man would stand if anyone had thought to use that term, and neither of them mentioned it. It was not a polished occasion. The cake Hannah made leaned to the left. Someone, probably Eli, knocked over a water bucket during the receiving portion, and it went across 3 people's boots. It was warm, and then briefly, inconveniently windy, which took 2 of the paper decorations Nell had made and distributed them across the pasture. There were not enough chairs, and some people stood, and others sat on the fence rails, and one of the older Hargrove boys fell off a fence rail and was fine but loud about it. It was imperfect in the way real things are imperfect, and Miriam wouldn't have changed any of it. That night, after the guests had gone, and the children were in bed, and the yard was quiet, Miriam stood the kitchen window and looked out at the ranch. She'd stood at this window 100 times in the past year, washing dishes, watching the weather, watching the children in the yard, watching the fence line where Rourke worked, watching the road north that she'd come down on horseback behind a grieving 13-year-old who'd told her she could take the next train east. She'd thought about that train a lot in the first weeks. 7 a.m. departure, the simple available option of leaving. She understood now that the option hadn't actually been as available as it appeared. Not because she couldn't have left. She could have easily, and no one would have stopped her, but because leaving would have required being a different person than she was, and she hadn't known how to do that. She'd looked at 8 frightened children, and a failing ranch, and a dead man's unfinished work, and something in her had simply refused to find the exit. It wasn't heroism. She knew it wasn't heroism because she'd been afraid the entire time, afraid the morning she didn't get on the train, afraid when Vane came to her yard, afraid when she heard footsteps in the night, afraid when she sent Rourke to Lincoln with everything they had and couldn't know if it would be enough. Courage and fear are not opposites. She'd learned that in a way she couldn't have learned it any other way. What she'd done was smaller and larger than heroism at the same time. She just kept doing the next thing. And the thing after that, she thought about what it meant that Jonas Weller had never known she'd stay. He'd written honestly about a struggling ranch and 8 children who needed someone, and he'd waited to see what came back. And what came back was a woman who'd said she was coming and then had arrived and found everything different from what she'd planned and had stayed anyway. He'd never gotten to see that. It was one of the specific unfairnesses she'd made her peace with imperfectly, and would probably continue to make her peace with imperfectly for the rest of her life. But she thought he would have understood it. Men who write honest letters tend to understand honest choices. Rourke came into the kitchen and stood beside her at the window. They looked at the yard together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Jonas," she said. He was quiet for a moment. This was one of the things she'd come to value about him, the fact that when she said something that mattered, he didn't immediately try to say something back. He let it exist. "Me too," he said finally. He knew, Miriam said, what Vane was doing. He knew the whole picture. He was trying to stop it, and he ran out of time. She paused. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if he'd lived. If things had gone the way they were supposed to, we would have married. He would have fought Vane. He might have won. He might have," Rourke said. "But he wouldn't have had the neighbors behind him. Not the way we did. He was one man on one property. I was nobody. Nobody who was supposed to be here. Nobody with any claim. Nobody Vane had prepared for." She looked at the dark yard. "I think maybe that was the only way to win, by being someone Vane hadn't accounted for. Rourke thought about this. He wrote to me," Rourke said. "In that letter, he said he needed someone who knew the land and the law. He didn't say he was scared, but I knew him. He was." He paused. He was scared, and he kept going. "Just like you. Just like everyone who showed up," Miriam said. That was the thing she'd spent a year learning that she hadn't expected to learn. She'd come to this valley as a stranger, carrying $60 and a carefully planned future that had lasted approximately as long as it took a 13-year-old to say, "My father's dead." She'd stayed because leaving felt wrong. She'd fought because someone had to. Not alone. She'd won because Dale Hargrove kept his receipts. because Ruth Foster pressed a ledger into her hands and said they'd been waiting for someone to do something, because Walt Giddens kept a record of every collection he'd made, because somewhere in himself he'd known it wasn't right, because Cole Arden had a limit and reached it, because Frank Chadwick's wife had told him to keep everything, because Emmett Crane had been watching Vane's manipulation for 3 years and waiting for someone with enough to fight back, because Caleb Weller had told his uncle to take the gray horse. People who look back at hard times tend to find one person in the story, one protagonist, one hero, one person who made the difference. It makes for a cleaner story. It's almost never what actually happened. What actually happened is usually more complicated and more ordinary and more extraordinary at the same time. What happened in Copper Hollow was that frightened people stopped being afraid enough to show up. And when enough frightened people show up together, they stop being frightened and start being something else. They start being a valley. Rourke put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned slightly against him in the unself-conscious way of two people still learning the geography of each other, and they stood at the kitchen window and looked at the dark yard. In the years that followed, the Weller Ranch grew. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and hard winters, and one year when the cattle prices dropped and they ate more cornmeal than anyone wanted to, and Miriam renegotiated the remaining mortgage terms through Emmett Crane with the calm precision of someone who has learned that a fair argument made clearly is worth more than desperation. The mortgage was paid off 11 years after Miriam had first read its death clause by lamplight at Jonas's desk. She didn't mark the occasion dramatically. She told Rourke over breakfast, and he said good, and they had another cup of coffee and went about the day, because the ranch had been theirs in every way that mattered for years already, and a piece of paper confirming it was satisfying but not transforming. Caleb became the rancher Jonas had been raising him to be. He was steady and serious, and occasionally too stubborn for his own good, which was a Weller family trait that neither Rourke nor Miriam attempted to argue him out of, because it was also the trait that made him good at what he did. He married a woman from a farm east of Copper Hollow when he was 22, a practical, clear-eyed woman named Dora, who took one look at the Weller operation and said she could see 3 things they were doing inefficiently, and who was right about all 3 of them, and whom the whole family loved immediately. Hannah went east for schooling at 20, not to Missouri, but to Lincoln, where she studied accounting with the specific ambition of someone who had been doing household accounts since she was 11 and had opinions about how to do them correctly. She came back. That mattered to Miriam more than she'd expected it to. Thomas took over the cattle operation alongside Caleb and never wanted to do anything else. Eli had a gift for fixing machinery that nobody had anticipated and that made him, as the years went on and farm equipment grew more complex, an invaluable person to know throughout the valley. Twins were the twins cheerful, chaotic, and fundamentally impossible to worry about, because they had a quality of resilience that seemed to come from somewhere deep and personal and entirely their own. Lucy grew into a woman who was quiet in the way of people with a great deal happening inside, and who filled journals with observations and stories, and the particular interior life she'd been building since childhood, and who eventually sent some of those writings to a newspaper in Omaha and had them published, and whom Miriam suspected had been watching the events of that first year very carefully and storing everything away. Maisie never remembered any of it. She knew the story the way you know family history, through repetition, through the texture of what surrounded her, through the specific way the adults around her talked about that first year when she was too young to know what was happening. She grew up in a house that had been fought for, though she didn't experience the fighting. She grew up with the creek running year-round through the south pasture and the knowledge that the water was theirs and had always been theirs, though she didn't remember a time when that had been in question. And Nell grew up and grew fierce and grew kind in the way of someone who'd started life asking every question the rest of them were afraid to ask and never stopped. She married eventually, left the ranch for a property 2 valleys over, came back every few months with her husband, and then with children of her own, crowding the kitchen table in exactly the way the Weller kitchen table had always been crowded. She was the one who asked Miriam, years later, when Miriam was sitting on the repaired porch, watching Nell's children run across the ranch yard with a dog they'd brought from home, she was the one who said, "What would you have done if you'd known?" Before you came. If you'd known Jonas was dead and the ranch was failing and Vane was waiting, would you have come? Miriam thought about it seriously, the way Nell's questions always deserved. No, she said. Nell looked at her. If I'd known all of it before I got here, Miriam said, I probably would have made the sensible decision and stayed in Missouri. She looked at the yard that had been sagging and neglected and that had a full, noisy life running across it now. That's the thing about the decisions that change your life. You usually can't see them clearly until after they're made. You just know the next thing you can do, and you either do it or you don't. Nell was quiet for a moment. I asked you once if you were going to be here tomorrow, Nell said. I remember. You said you'd be there when I woke up. I know, and you were. Miriam looked at her, this woman who had been a 5-year-old standing in a dark doorway in a nightgown that was too big for her, holding a worn blanket, brave enough to knock on a stranger's door and ask the question everyone else was afraid to ask. Yes, Miriam said, I was. The creek ran in the south pasture. The yard was full of noise. Inside, someone was laughing Rourke, she thought. By the sound of it, probably in response to something one of the grandchildren had done, because children had a way of finding his laugh that their own children had also had, back when they were small, and the ranch was still learning how to hold them. The afternoon light moved across the yard, and Miriam sat on her porch, on the land she'd fought for and hadn't known she needed, and understood not for the first time, but maybe more clearly than she ever had, that the life you plan and the life you live are almost never the same thing. And that sometimes, when the plan falls apart at a train station on a summer morning, what's waiting on the other side of that moment isn't loss. Sometimes it's everything. The autumn that Maisie turned 16, she found the folder. It had been moved twice over the years out of the bedroom, where Miriam had kept it under the mattress in those first desperate weeks, into the bottom drawer of Jonas's desk, and finally into a flat cedar box that lived on the top shelf of the front room bookcase, alongside the family Bible, and a small photograph of Jonas that someone had taken the year before he died, and that Miriam had framed and placed there, deliberately, so the children would grow up seeing their father's face in the room where the family gathered. Maisie brought the folder to Miriam on a Saturday afternoon in October with the careful, slightly uncertain manner of someone who has found something they suspect is significant and isn't sure whether finding it was allowed. What is all this? Maisie asked. Miriam set down the sock she was darning and looked at the folder in Maisie's hands. The oilskin covering had cracked along one edge. The papers inside were yellowed at the margins. Sit down, Miriam said. Maisie sat. Miriam took the folder and opened it and looked at the papers inside the deed with Aldous Pren's stamp, the survey maps, the correspondence, Jonas's careful handwriting on documents he'd collected while running out of time. She looked at them the way you look at things that were once urgent and are now history, with a specific tenderness you can only feel when the danger has long passed. This is what your father left us, Miriam said. She told Maisie the whole story then, in the way she hadn't told it before, not the family version, not the version softened for children, but the full version. The death clause, the water fees, the night with the torches, Rourke riding to Lincoln in the dark, Cole Arden sitting in a room and telling the truth about what he'd done, the stay of enforcement arriving on the same afternoon as the arson confession. All of it. Maisie listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Maisie, who had inherited Nell's directness along with Eleanor's dark curls, and who generally treated silence as a problem to be solved. When Miriam finished, Maisie was quiet for a moment. Papa did all this, she said. Before he died, he started it, Miriam said. A lot of people finished it, but he started it alone. Yes. Maisie looked at the folder, at the papers her father's hands had touched in the last months of his life. He never got to know it worked, she said. No, Miriam said. He didn't. Maisie sat with that, the way young people sit with the specific unfairness of the world, feeling it fully, without the protective distance that comes with age. Not fair, she said. No, Miriam agreed, it isn't. But you stayed. Maisie looked at her. You didn't know any of this when you stayed. You stayed because of us. Miriam thought about how to answer that honestly. I stayed because leaving felt wrong, she said. I stayed because you were 8 children alone in a house, and Maisie, she stopped. She still did that occasionally, used the name, and then caught herself, because saying it to the person it belonged to had a different weight than saying it in memory. Because you were sick, and someone needed to be there. I didn't stay for a reason that was bigger than that. The bigger reasons came after. Maisie looked at the cedar box, at the photograph of Jonas on the shelf above it. Do you think he knew? She asked. When he wrote those letters to you, do you think he knew you were that you'd be like this? Miriam looked at the photograph. Jonas Weller, looking directly at the camera with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who found being photographed awkward, but with something in his eyes that the discomfort didn't quite hide something steady and clear, and, she had always thought, fundamentally decent. I think he hoped, she said. He didn't know, but I think he hoped. Maisie nodded slowly. Then she said, I want to learn how to read these survey maps. Miriam looked at her. The deed, Maisie said, pulling the relevant document from the folder with the careful hands of someone who understood she was touching something old. Rourke knows how to read them, right? He taught Caleb. He did. Then I want to learn too. Maisie looked at the map, turning it slightly, trying to orient herself. This is our land. I should understand what it says. Miriam watched her, this youngest child, who remembered nothing of the year that had defined everything, reading the document that had been at the center of it, deciding she wanted to understand the thing her father had died protecting. Something settled in Miriam's chest that had never entirely settled before. She put the darning down. Come on, she said. Rourke's in the barn. We'll ask him now. They found Rourke in the barn, doing exactly what he was usually doing on a Saturday afternoon, working on something that needed working on. In this case, a harness that had been repaired twice already and was reaching the end of its useful arguments against being replaced. He looked up when they came in, and his eyes went from Miriam's face to the folder in Maisie's hands, and he understood immediately. Because after years of marriage, he read her face, the way an experienced surveyor reads, land knowing where the elevation changes were before he got to them. She found the folder, he said. She wants to learn the survey maps, Miriam said. Rourke set the harness down. He took the map from Maisie and spread it on the workbench and began explaining it the same way he'd explained it to Caleb years before directly, without condescension, treating her as someone capable of understanding a complex thing if it was explained clearly. Miriam stood in the barn doorway and watched. Outside, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons did in Nebraska, the light going gold and long, the shadows stretching early. Air carrying the specific smell of coming cold that meant winter was still a consideration rather than a fact. The south pasture was visible from where she stood, and the creek beyond it, catching the afternoon light in pieces where it moved over rocks. The creek that Jonas had refused to sell. The creek that Vane had tried to dam and steal and use as the mechanism of an empire built on other people's desperation. Creek that still ran, year-round, the way it had always run, indifferent to the human machinery that had briefly tried to redirect it. In the barn, Rourke was saying something about prior appropriation, and Maisie was asking a sharp, specific question that made him pause and then revise his explanation, which was very Maisie. Somewhere up at the house, the sound of the kitchen door, Hannah's oldest visiting for the week, probably going in for water. The dog that belonged to no one in particular, and everyone in general was asleep against the south wall of the barn, in a patch of remaining sun. Miriam thought about the woman who had stood on a train platform 14 years ago with $60 and a trunk and a plan that lasted approximately 4 minutes. She thought about what that woman had known and hadn't known, expected and hadn't expected. She thought about the 7 a.m. train east that had come and gone while she was treating a feverish baby and how she hadn't noticed it leaving. She thought about what she would tell that woman now, if she could. Not that it would be fine. It wasn't always fine. There were winters that were brutal, and years that were lean, and arguments that went too long, and losses that didn't stop hurting just because time passed. Rourke's back had gotten worse the last 2 years, and there were days the cold made it serious, and he didn't complain, but she knew. And knowing without being able to fix it was its own kind of weight. Caleb had lost a third of his herd to illness 4 years back, and it had taken 2 years to rebuild, and during those 2 years he'd been someone it was hard to reach, closed off in the specific way of people who need to be alone with their grief and don't know how to ask for that. Hannah's first pregnancy had ended in a loss that the whole family had felt, and that Hannah had carried quietly in the way. Hannah carried most hard things inward and private and emerging eventually, not unscathed but intact. Life on this land was not a reward, it was just life. difficult and sometimes beautiful and frequently inconvenient, and occasionally more than she thought she could manage, and then manageable anyway. What she would tell that woman on the platform was simply, stay. Not because it will be easy, not because it will look like what you planned. Stay because the children need you and because the work is real, and because a man named Jonas Weller left something unfinished that deserves to be finished, and you are the one who is here. Stay because someday a 16-year-old girl will find a folder of old documents and want to understand what her father built, and you will walk her to the barn. And someone you love will spread a map on a workbench and explain it to her clearly. And the afternoon light will come through the barn door and fall across the three of you, and it will not be a perfect moment or a dramatic one. It will just be the life that grew from the choice to stay. And it will be enough. It will be more than enough. It will be everything.